Chapter 367. The northern part of Tianliang County was still rather cold. Gaoliang was not very high, but it could hide a person. Presumably, that person was extremely skilled in concealing his tracks and was a true assassin. Su Li did not pay any attention to the assassin hiding in the plains. No matter how dangerous that person was in his eyes, it was not as important as the bright Shui He. Shui He continued to walk towards the two. His armor clanked and his blade intent whistled through the air. His footsteps were steady and firm. As he got closer and closer, he looked at Chen Chongqing and asked warily, "And who are you?" Chen Chongqing did not intentionally restrain his qi, so Shui He could see that he had already entered the upper level of ethereal opening. To be able to enter the upper level of ethereal opening at such a young age, he was definitely not a normal person. Shui He had never even met such a person before. He expressionlessly said, "If I didn't know that Qiushan Jun was heavily injured in the Garden of Zhou and was far away in Mount Li, if you didn't have such an ordinary appearance, I really would have suspected that you were Qiushan Jun." Chen Chongqing finally confirmed that the demons, or perhaps that mysterious black robe, for some reason, had not sent the news that he was following Su Li to the south. He could not help but begin to think if Shui He knew his identity, would he stop? Just then, Su Li's voice rang out, "If your elder brother Shui Xingchuan were here, he would definitely not mistake him for Qiushan Jun. This kid is only at the upper level of ethereal opening, while my Qiushan has already succeeded in star condensation. Can't he even see this difference?" Only a person like Su Li would use the word talented when commenting on this matter, and in the current younger generation of cultivators, probably only Qiushan Jun could firmly suppress Chen Chongqing. This was the truth, but for some reason, Chen Chongqing felt somewhat depressed. Perhaps it was because Su Li had mentioned Qiushan Jun in a very intimate tone that made him momentarily forget to tell Shui He his identity. And at this moment, Shui He had already arrived less than 10 zhang away from the two. His hand had already completely fused with the hilt of the blade, and the 6 blade intents had already fused into one, forming a world of their own. Shui He had already made his preparations to attack. His qi had already been raised to its peak. The star domain that only star condensation experts could summon was extremely perfect. He used the blade, so his star domain was the blade domain. No matter how much of a genius Chen Chongqing was, he was still too young and had a limited amount of time to cultivate. Furthermore, there were problems with his meridians in the first place, so the amount of quintessence he could bring out was limited. There was no way he could break this perfect saber domain. Most of the time, the gap between realms couldn't be bridged with courage, willpower, determination, or technique. He stared at Shui He's visor, which was extremely bright under the morning light, and slowly pulled out the short sword from its sheath. In a very short period of time, he had performed many calculations in his sea of consciousness. The countless examples of battles that he had seen in the Taoist canon and the books of the Orthodox Academy floated before his eyes, but he still could not do anything. Without question, the 28th Divine General of the continent, Shui He, was the strongest opponent he had ever encountered since he began cultivating. Purely in terms of cultivation, he was equal to the demon general couple in the Garden of Zhou. However, in order to enter the Garden of Zhou, the demon general couple had forcefully used a secret technique to suppress their cultivation. Because of the restrictions of the Garden of Zhou, when they fought, they had almost never revealed the true strength of the star condensation realm. The golden-winged great Ping that Nank had ignited her soul to awaken had been chopped down from the vault of heaven by his 10,000 swords. However, the majority of the power of that strike had come from the desire of the 10,000 broken swords in the sword pool that had accumulated for several hundred years. That kind of willpower and imposing manner had nothing to do with him, and the opportunity had not come. Right now, the 10,000 broken swords in his sheath could no longer display such a great power. How could he defeat this powerful opponent? Chen Chongqing gripped the short sword and stared at the approaching Shui He, his heart growing more and more nervous. Shui He knew that he was his opponent, yet he did not pay much attention to him. His gaze fell behind him, always looking at Su Li. Let alone being heavily injured, even if he was on the verge of death and only had one last breath left, as long as Su Li was still alive, he would be the most terrifying expert of the continent. Su Li was also looking at him. But in reality, Su Li was not looking at him, but at his blade domain. Suddenly, Su Li's gaze fell on a certain place in the air in front of him. At the same time, he extended his hand and gripped the handle of the yellow paper umbrella. Within the yellow paper umbrella was the heaven-shrouding sword, and the handle of the umbrella was the hilt of the sword. Back then on the snowy plains, Su Li had gripped the hilt of the sword, and his sword intent had invaded like fire, directly killing a demon general several dozen li away. Now that Shui He was right in front of him, he could even more sense that intense danger. Without any warning, purely out of an instinctive vigilance, Shui He exploded with an incomparably powerful qi. The morning light was like before, and the armor on his body instantly became incomparably bright. With a clang, the metal blade was unsheathed, and through Chen Chongqing's shoulder, it chopped down at Su Li's hand that gripped the handle of the umbrella. A violent hurricane arose from the verdant sorghum. On the entire journey south, Chen Chongqing was most clear on Su Li's current condition. Let alone using his sword to kill, he could not even walk. He did not understand why Su Li would grip the handle of the umbrella, why he would use his sword intent to force Shui He to suddenly strike. This was a question that Su Li had given him. Chen Chongqing thought for a very short amount of time before obtaining the answer. This was because Su Li had taught him a lot, and he had studied very seriously, not forgetting a single word or phrase. A few days ago, Su Li had once said to him that the most important thing in battle was the instant when one switched from defense to offense. If one could truly catch the opponent off guard, then even the strongest opponent could still lose. Shui He striking seemed to be because of Su Li's actions, because of his vigilance and unease, and because he was forced to do so, but in reality, he was also going with the flow, because only like this could he truly catch the opponent off guard. In order to kill an expert on Su Li's level, before Shui He struck, he had assuredly calculated all the details. As expected, the most important moment in battle was the moment when one switched from defense to offense. But was it only because doing this well would bring benefits? No, Chen Chongqing remembered very clearly that after Su Li said these words, he had given another explanation. Even the strongest opponent, in the instant when one switched from defense to offense, would have to expend even more effort, so it was also at this moment that it was the easiest to reveal a flaw. In other words, an enemy so powerful that it was almost perfect would only become imperfect in the instant when one switched from defense to offense. Chen Chongqing's eyes lit up, because of the descending snow-like glow of Shui He's blade, and also because of the gradually flourishing morning light. His dagger had already pierced out 3 forms of Wenshui, hanging sunset. The dagger buzzed, carrying with it all the morning light on the sorghum. Vibrating at high speeds, it pierced towards Shui He's chest. As a star condensation expert, Shui He's domain formed from his 7 blades was impregnable. Even in the instant when he switched from defense to offense, he might leave behind a weak point in his defense, but how could he let Chen Chongqing see it? Chen Chongqing truly could not see it, but there were people who could. Su Li only needed a glance to see where the weak point of Shui He's blade domain was. He extended his hand and gripped the handle of the yellow paper umbrella, provoking Shui He to strike. His gaze had always been fixed on a certain place in the air in front of Shui He. Chen Chongqing's dagger followed Su Li's gaze and pierced over. With a soft squelch, it was like a skin bag filled with wine had been pierced, or like a sugar figurine that had been blown up had been secretly pierced by a naughty child with a bamboo skewer. In the bright morning light that enveloped Shui He, a path suddenly appeared. The sharp sword glow had already arrived in front of his chest. On the bright armor, one could even see the shadow of the sword. Due to some emotional problems, writing was rather strenuous. The next chapter will be updated very late. There is no need for everyone to wait. Chapter 368. Chen Chongqing's sword arrived in front of Shui He. The truly sharp sword was Su Li's gaze. But if a star condensation expert could be so easily defeated, why would the Taoist canon call the star domain an individual world? The bright morning light suddenly changed for an instant. Shui He's hand reached behind his back and pulled out a second blade. Because his movements were truly too fast, a blur appeared, as if a second him had appeared in the morning light. The sharp, snow-white blade descended even faster than sound, chopping towards Chen Chongqing's head. Chen Chongqing's sword energy was about to run out, so he had no way of changing the trajectory of the dagger, much less blocking this blade. What could he do? A buzzing sound came from the green sorghum again. A heavy iron sword appeared out of nowhere and blocked Shui He's blade. Even with Shui He's level of cultivation, he could not break this metal sword. This metal sword was the Mountain Sea Sword. Shui He's face was expressionless. Another blur appeared, and with unimaginable speed, he pulled out a second blade from his back and chopped down. His movements were truly too fast. When the second blade descended, the Mountain Sea Sword had just met the first blade. With Chen Chongqing's strength, it was simply impossible for him to keep up with such a fast speed, because it was impossible for ethereal opening cultivators to draw their swords so quickly. However, the way he drew his sword was different from other people in the world. He did not need to shake his wrist to draw his sword, did not need to make any movements, not even need to move his fingers. He only needed to use his spiritual sense, and a sword would fly out of its sheath, blocking the blade in Shui He's hand. The second sword was the South Stream Temple's Holy Maiden Sword. Shui He's pupils constricted, clearly shaken by Chen Chongqing's two famed swords that had appeared out of nowhere. However, the movements of his hand did not slow in the slightest. Another blur appeared in the morning light, and he struck out a third time. Almost at the same time as the third blade fell, Chen Chongqing summoned a third sword. Only a truly powerful sword, a sword that was in relatively good condition, could block Divine General Shui He's powerful blade, so the third sword was the Demon Commander's banner sword. Everything happened too quickly, in the blink of an eye. The morning light flickered faintly and the afterimages appeared again. Shui He seemed to have turned into 6 people, pulling out 6 blades and slashing towards Chen Chongqing's head. Chen Chongqing seemed to be motionless in front of him, yet 6 swords appeared out of nowhere and blocked in front of him. Only now did the continuous sounds of collisions resound. It was like a series of spring thunder that bloomed in the green plains. Shui He's blade was too fast. If Chen Chongqing was only relying on his own ability, he definitely wouldn't be able to block it, but Shui He probably didn't expect this youngster to have such a strange technique. What were those swords? This was not the end. Shui He's 6 afterimages vanished at the same time, returning to his original body. The blade that he had slashed at Su Li actually swept downwards, once again slashing at Chen Chongqing's neck. This was his first blade and also his last blade. It was the real blade. When this saber landed, the 7 sabers became a perfect world again. His saber domain was perfected once more, and all the holes from before disappeared without a trace. As the blade descended, Shui He's gaze was very cold, as if he was asking Chen Chongqing, "Do you still have more swords?" The terrifying blade energy brought about by the 7 blades crushed Chen Chongqing to the point where breathing became extremely difficult, and even his thoughts seemed to slow down. Otherwise, perhaps he would have thought of a sentence. "I still have more than 10,000 swords, and I also need to tell you?" But at this moment, even if he sent out 10,000 swords, it would still be meaningless, because Shui He's saber domain had descended once more. His dagger could not break through, could not stab into his opponent's body. The gap between cultivation levels was just this hard to make up for. Fortunately, Su Li was still behind him. He looked at Shui He, his calm gaze like a sword that had been washed in autumn water. "Heavenly Palace," he said, his gaze falling on Shui He's ribs. Chen Chongqing's dagger followed. Shui He's expression turned slightly cold. He had used a profound method to reconstruct his saber domain, but who could have thought that Su Li would still only need a glance to see through his only weakness? But he was not worried, because Su Li was already heavily injured. He could only speak, but could not use his sword. As a star condensation expert, coupled with his armor, it was not something that a youth at ethereal opening could break through. So he did not hesitate, and decided to quickly end this battle, no longer paying attention to Chen Chongqing's dagger. If this battle was analyzed in hindsight, apart from Su Li's insight and Chen Chongqing's strength and composure that far exceeded his age, the most important reason was that Shui He had made a fatal mistake at the most crucial moment. He did not think that the seemingly ordinary dagger in Chen Chongqing's hand was actually one of the sharpest swords in the world, especially after being baptized by the wind and rain in the garden of Zhou. This dagger possessed the sword intent of the Dragoncry sword, possessed its own sword spirit, and inherited the unparalleled heroic will of Qin Xuanba from countless years ago. It was actually able to display a power that surpassed its cultivation level. With a squelch, the dagger in Chen Chongqing's hand pierced through the bright armor on Shui He's body, breaking through his body that was as hard as metal and stone after purification. Like a violent gale, it continued to advance, as if it wanted to destroy everything in its path. An angry howl mixed with shock and pain rang out. Shui He had never thought that his moment of carelessness would allow this ethereal opening youth to succeed and place himself in such a dangerous situation. The true essence in his body exploded out. Chen Chongqing's dagger could not continue forward. Shui He used his entire cultivation, condensing the star domain in front of his chest, and forcefully used his true essence to block this dagger. The blade in his hand continued to chop towards Chen Chongqing's neck. Let alone the fact that Chen Chongqing's dagger could not continue forward, even if it could, it would at most heavily injure Shui He, but this blade would definitely cut off his head. It was like this. Chen Chongqing knew that he had lost. He did not think that a star condensation expert, at the juncture of life and death, could actually explode with such a terrifying battle strength, actually able to transform true essence into something that seemed to have substance. For him to be able to cultivate to the upper level of ethereal opening at this age, he could already be considered a peerless genius, but in front of a star condensation expert, he still seemed to be unable to withstand a single blow. Even with Su Li's guidance, even with his performance exceeding his own level. His defeat to Shui He was actually a very natural matter. But why was he still somewhat unwilling? Was he unwilling to die, or was he unwilling to die immediately without being able to truly injure Shui He? Chen Chongqing did not think this way. He knew that he could injure Shui He, so he continued to attack, not caring that he might die in the next moment. In a battle between cultivators, it was extremely rare to see a sudden change in sword energy at the last moment, because this went against the common sense of cultivation and the principles of nature. Unless before the sword was attacked, this change had already been hidden in the sword technique. This kind of sword technique was extremely rare. In the last few years, the most famous of this sword techniques was called the Burning Heaven Sword. The Burning Heaven Sword was a sword technique of Mount Li, a secret technique created by Su Li himself. In terms of ingenuity, it was even above the secret sword of the Golden Crow. What Chen Chongqing used was the Burning Heaven Sword. He knew this kind of sword technique and had used it before in the Grand Examination, but at that time, he had used his fist as a sword. This was the first time he had truly used this sword technique. Chen Chongqing's sword used an incomprehensible method to flick upwards, drawing a seemingly natural line on Shui He's bright armor. The hard armor incessantly shattered and sprayed. It was like a field ignited by lightning, spitting flames towards the sky. Fuck! An extremely clear sound rang out. With a spurt of blood, Shui He's left arm was cut off and sent flying into the sky. Almost at the same time, Shui He's blade landed on Chen Chongqing's neck. With a thunderous explosion, the flames on the field were completely extinguished. Chen Chongqing's knee landed heavily on the ground in front of the carriage. The earth shook and dust flew into the air. Only now did the mountain sea sword and the other 5 broken swords descend from the sky. With a sound, they landed by his side. Chapter 369. There was silence. Shui He's left arm had been severed. From his abdomen to his shoulder was a pool of blood. His face was pale. His right hand gripped the blade and rested it on Chen Chongqing's neck. Chen Chongqing's head had not been chopped off. Shui He's blade energy had been exhausted and could not continue forward. At some point, an old umbrella had appeared between the blade and Chen Chongqing's neck. A rather tired voice rang out, "You've lost." The old umbrella was held in Su Li's hand. These words came from his mouth. Shui He withdrew the blade in his hand and slowly and heavily retreated 2 steps. He looked at Su Li with a pale face and asked somewhat perplexedly, "This is that yellow paper umbrella?" Then he looked at Chen Chongqing in front of the carriage. He looked at the youth covered in dust and confirmed that his head was still on his neck. The perplexed expression on his face grew even stronger and he muttered, "How can it be so sturdy?" Previously, when he had risked his blade domain to chop down, he had condensed the cultivation of his entire life, the full power strike of a star condensation expert. Even if Su Li had exceeded everyone's expectations and still had the strength to fight, even if that yellow paper umbrella could block all sharpness in the world, it could not stop the transmission of power. Logically speaking, Chen Chongqing's neck should have been severed no matter what, but now it seemed that he had not received any damage. Shui He was very confused. Just what material was this youth's body made of? It was actually countless times more exaggerated than a perfect purification. Suddenly, the carriage collapsed, turning into countless fragments. The ground under the carriage also neatly sank down half a foot. Su Li fell to the ground, coughing from the dust and incessantly waving his hands. Chen Chongqing stood up with difficulty and held his sword horizontally in front of him, preparing to deal with Shui He's following attack. He was currently in great pain. His sea of consciousness trembled as if it could shatter at any moment. The world in front of him was a blur and he could faint at any moment. Fortunately, Su Li's gaze was very accurate, so he could see through his blade technique and easily point out the only flaw in his blade domain. If he said Shui He had lost, then Shui He had really lost. Chen Chongqing's short sword had cut a deep wound on his armor. Although it wasn't able to break through his true essence defense and pierce through his heart, the sword force of the one sword strike of burning heaven had already shattered all the meridians in the left half of his body. For a short period of time, Shui He no longer had the ability to fight. If he could leave alive, who knew how long it would take for him to recover to his original state? Shui He held on to the place where his arm was continuously bleeding and looked at Chen Chongqing. His emotions were very complicated. He could never have imagined that he would actually lose to this youngster's sword. Suddenly, he thought of a possibility. His expression changed slightly and he asked, "You are Chen Chongqing?" Chen Chongqing had just walked on the edge of life and death, and his mind was still in a daze. The power of Shui He's blade was still flooding his sea of consciousness, and he couldn't clearly hear what Shui He was saying. Shui He thought that Chen Chongqing had tacitly agreed, and could not help but be stunned. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he did not say anything. He turned to Su Li and said, "I didn't think that Sir Su could still use your sword. I really brought disgrace on this trip." Su Li raised his eyebrows slightly and said with some dissatisfaction, "This is just an umbrella, not a sword. If I use my sword and you can still stand, then it should be my turn to feel disgrace." Shui was silent for a while and realized that there was no doubt in his words. After a while, he sincerely asked for guidance. Sir, could it be that my blade really can't compare to Wang Po? Of the 38 divine generals of the continent, very few people used the blade, and none of them used the blade as well as Shui. However, on this continent there was still one expert who used the blade, and he was also considered to be the person with the strongest blade after Zhou Dufu. That person was Wang Po of Tianliang. When everyone mentioned Shui, they would praise his blade technique as godly, but they would inevitably add that he was just not as good as Wang Po. Shui had come today to kill Su Li, but at the moment when his life was about to end, the matter that he could not let go of the most was not Su Li's life or death, nor was it his own life or death, but this matter. He wanted to hear what Su Li had to say, so that he could leave with peace of mind, or perhaps convince himself. Of course you are not as good as Wang Po, whether it's the blade or the person. Su Li did not give this divine general who was on the verge of death any comfort or gentleness, and said very directly. Shui was not angry. He seriously asked for guidance. What's the reason? Su Li said, Wang Po only uses one blade, and you use 7, so you are not as good as him. Shui seemed to understand something. He knew that if he could understand these words, he would definitely make great progress on the path of the blade. Just as he was feeling happy, he suddenly remembered that he was about to die, and could not help but laugh at himself. Chen Chongqing had been somewhat distracted by that blade strike, and now he finally began to slowly wake up. Su Li did not say anything, and Shui also did not say anything. The scene was quiet. He looked at Shui and then looked at Su Li. Somewhat perplexed, he asked, Next, what do we do? Su Li looked at him like he was looking at an idiot and said, What do we do? Of course it's to quickly kill him, and then continue on our way. Shui looked at Chen Chongqing, and also felt very baffled. He thought to himself, What are you waiting for, young man? Senior, you want me to kill him? Chen Chongqing was the one who felt the most baffled. Su Li glared at him and said, Don't tell me you want me to do it myself? Shui said somewhat angrily, Don't tell me you want me to do it myself? Chen Chongqing stared blankly and said, Can't no one do it? Must I kill him? The scene once again returned to silence, and a fresh and clean wind blew through the green plains. After a long period of silence, Su Li sighed with emotion. I'm finding it more and more difficult to understand young people nowadays. Shui nodded his head in agreement. Chen Chongqing looked at Shui and said, Sir Divine General, can you treat today's matter as if it never happened? And what I mean is, can you not hold a grudge? Shui suddenly felt that this youth was very pleasing to the eye. No wonder his elder brother had said in the letter that this youth was very pleasing to the eye. The more he looked, the more pleasing he became. He said, You spared my life. I will remember your kindness. Chen Chongqing looked at Su Li, using his eyes to express an inquiry. Su Li was very annoyed. He said, Since you're not going to do it, what are you standing there for? Let's go. Chen Chongqing sheathed the 6 broken swords that were scattered on the ground, then stuck his hand into his mouth and blew 2 whistles. His technique was not good, so the whistle he blew out was rather dull and hoarse. It was not pleasant to hear, and it could not travel far. Fortunately, the 2 furry deer did not run far. Hearing the sound, they came over. Chen Chongqing helped Su Li onto the back of one of the furry deer, and then rode onto the back of the other furry deer. Holding onto 2 ropes, they walked into the distance of the sorghum. Seeing the 2 people and 2 deer gradually disappear into the green plains, Shui was silent. It was unknown what he was thinking. Su Li sat on the furry deer and said to Chen Chongqing, I really admire you. Chen Chongqing laughed somewhat embarrassedly and said, Senior, you're too polite. Su Li suppressed his anger and said, I'm polite to your 18 generations of ancestors, am I talking about this? Chen Chongqing asked in confusion, Then what do you admire me for? Su Li said, Are all the young people these days as stupid as you? Chen Chongqing said, You mean, I didn't kill him? I think that, if it was Go Hanshi, he wouldn't have done it just now. Su Li sneered, A woman's benevolence will never amount to anything great. If the future of humanity is people like you, then what future will there be? Sooner or later, humanity will be exterminated by the demons. Chen Chongqing thought it over, then said, Isn't it precisely because I'm this kind of person that Senior is willing to teach me and want me to become the next pope? Su Li was silent for a while, then said, It seems rather reasonable. But have you never thought that he will leak out our whereabouts? And that he will take revenge on you in the future? Chen Chongqing said, I've never thought about it carefully. If Senior is able to return to Mount Li alive, just who would dare to take revenge on me? Su Li said, That assassin hiding in the sorghum might kill he and then say that you killed him. Have you ever thought about this? Chen Chongqing turned to look at him and said in shock, This? I really haven't thought about it. Su Li looked into his bright and clear eyes and suddenly did not want to continue speaking. He sighed with emotion, How could I hope that a guy like you can become the Pope? For some reason, Chen Chongqing felt rather apologetic. He comforted him, Senior's vision should not be wrong. The next chapter will be very, very late, possibly even later than yesterday. Chapter 370. The morning light gradually brightened and the morning wind did not rise. The green seedlings that had just reached his knees no longer swayed. He loosened his right hand and the stump of his arm was no longer bleeding. He picked up the 7 blades from the ground and slowly sheathed them. In the entire process, his pale face occasionally flashed with a pained expression. It was very clear that these simple actions were extremely difficult for him. Su Li and Chen Chongqing had already left on the furry deer, but he did not leave. Instead, he sat down and bandaged his wounds while thinking about something. After the Ivy Festival and the Grand Examination, Chen Chongqing's reputation had long since spread beyond the capital. His brother Xue Xingchuan had specially mentioned this youth in a letter. He knew that this youth was the youngest principal of the Orthodox Academy in history. It could even be said that he represented the orthodoxy and the old imperial clan in speaking to the divine empress. But this youth should be undergoing trials in the Garden of Zhou. Why did he suddenly appear in the north of Tianliang County with Su Li? Of course, the main reason he did not immediately leave was not because he was thinking, but because he was waiting for the assassin hidden in the Green Plains to appear. He did not know who the assassin was, although he had obtained Su Li's whereabouts from him. He only knew that since the assassin had not gone far, it meant that he was in great danger. When he left, Su Li had said to Chen Chongqing that the assassin would take advantage of He's heavy injuries to kill him and then push the matter onto Chen Chongqing's head. He himself also thought this way. Suddenly, a cool breeze blew across the quiet field. The green sorghum bent slightly in the wind, revealing a figure that looked like a stone. Suddenly, the figure disappeared again. It should have gotten closer. He's right hand reached behind him and grasped the hilt of his blade. As a divine general of the Great Zhou, even if he had no more strength to fight, he would still die in battle. If he really was fated to die by the hands of these sneaky people, then it was better to die by his own blade. The cool breeze continued to blow, but the assassin still did not appear. After an unknown amount of time, the sunlight gradually intensified. Just when He, who had lost too much blood, could not hold on any longer, he suddenly realized that the assassin had already left. Why did the assassin leave? He did not understand. He used his blade to support his body and stood up with difficulty. Then, he saw that on the ground not far away, someone had used the edge of a sword to write a very clear line of words. The assassin must have seen that line of words, so he did not make a move in the end. Lu Qing, Zhou Tong will know what you have done. He's expression changed slightly. He did not think that the assassin was actually the legendary Lu Qing. Nor did he think that Su Li and Chen Chongqing would actually leave behind such words before they left. It was these words that saved his life. By a lake 500 li north of Tianliang County, 2 furry deer were currently drinking water with their heads lowered. Chen Chongqing was currently following Su Li's instructions, cleaning the grass and fruits that the furry deer were about to eat. The lake water was rather cold. He gazed at Su Li, who was resting by the lake, and asked curiously, "Who is Lu Qing?" The words on that piece of sorghum had been written by him with his dagger, but the contents had been spoken by Su Li. He had absolutely no idea what those words meant. Su Li said, "It's in the birch forest, in the sorghum field, that guy who never dared to show his face." Chen Chongqing was a little surprised and said, "That assassin? Is it very powerful?" Su Li casually said, "When those old fellows in the pavilion of divination were bored, they once privately ranked the assassins of the continent. Lu Qing was ranked third. Third on the ranking of assassins." Chen Chongqing thought about how he had been secretly followed by such a terrifying assassin the entire time, and immediately felt the wind blowing over the lake become rather cold. He subconsciously looked around. Only, the terrifying assassin ranked third on the ranking of assassins actually had such an ordinary name? He was somewhat confused. Su Li opened his eyes and said, "The more professional an assassin is, the less attention they attract. The outstanding assassin that has always been ranked first on the ranking of assassins doesn't even have a name." Chen Chongqing felt that these words were rather strange. Just what sort of person was this assassin that ranked first on the ranking of assassins that Su Li would actually praise as outstanding? It must be known that even the Tianhai Divine Empress and the Pope did not receive too much respect from Su Li's words. He could not understand, so he changed the subject and asked, "Sir, what was the meaning of those words you wanted me to leave behind?" Xue He is Xue Xingchuan's younger brother, and Xue Xingchuan is Zhou Tong's only friend. If Zhou Tong were to find out that Lu Qing killed Xue He, Lu Qing's fate would definitely be very miserable. Lu Qing is also afraid of Lord Zhou Tong. The more they cannot see the light, the more they fear Zhou Tong. Including that outstanding assassin ranked first on the ranking of assassins. That person is obviously an exception. But Senior, you said before that after he killed Xue he could disguise it as me. Since he's an assassin ranked third on the ranking of assassins, he definitely has a way to set it up. There's nothing suspicious about it. I know he's Lu Qing, so as long as I'm alive, Zhou Tong will know. Lord Zhou Tong will believe your words. There's no need to believe. It's enough for Zhou Tong to suspect that Lu Qing killed him. But there's no proof. When has Zhou Tong ever needed proof for his actions? Chen Chongqing thought about those terrifying rumors regarding Lord Zhou Tong, and thought that it really was like this. The people of the capital said that Zhou Tong's name could stop infants from crying at night, and now it seemed that it could even intimidate an assassin ranked third on the ranking of assassins. He said, "I still don't understand, why did that assassin want to kill Xue He?" Su Li looked at him and arched his brows. "I don't understand even more, why didn't you kill Xue He? Divine General Xue He came to kill Senior, not to kill me. Just like you said, after he knew who I was, he clearly did not have any killing intent towards me. Since that's the case, he already has no way of killing Senior, so why must I kill him? Senior, you seem to have forgotten, in terms of factions, Divine General Xue He and I should be closer than Senior." Chen Chongqing said, "On the other hand, since Senior wanted me to kill Xue He, why did you want me to leave behind those words before I left?" Su Li said, "Since you're not willing to kill him, you obviously have to let him live. You owe him enough, so as to avoid suffering a loss." Chen Chongqing did not know how to respond, so he changed the subject. "I don't know when that assassin will strike." He gazed at the surface of the lake in the sunset, very worried. The reputation of the junior martial uncle of Mount Li would naturally be stronger than Zhou Tong's, but the current Su Li no longer had that kind of deterrent force. especially after he had blocked Shui He's blade for Chen Chongqing in the morning. The assassin is a profession that requires success the most, so it has to be the most conservative. Su Li gazed at the sunset in the lake and said, "Before completely confirming the state of my injuries and the limits of your abilities, he will not appear, much less act. He will only continue to wait like a retard." The chapter name is rather cool. The original version is even longer and cooler, but the chapter names of the world of creation cannot exceed 20 characters. I've already had several unpleasant experiences with this, so I've decided to respond. See you tomorrow. Chapter 371. The sunset glow on the horizon gradually disappeared, and so did the glow on the lake. The wind blowing from the lake grew colder and colder. The fire by the lake had already been extinguished, leaving behind only a few embers that did not have any warmth. Chen Chongqing tightened his clothes and looked at the lake and mountains for a long time without saying anything. That assassin that had never appeared and could suddenly appear at any time, just where was he? Su Li knew what he was feeling right now and said, "I said before, since he decided to wait, he will continue to wait like a retard, until he reaches his own death." These words clearly implied something. Chen Chongqing thought, what if that assassin could not wait any longer? He did not believe that he would have any chance against such an expert. Senior still has the strength to fight? From the snowy plains to the south, Su Li could not even walk. This morning, at the most crucial moment, he had used the yellow paper umbrella to block He's final blade. This inevitably gave Chen Chongqing some hope. Su Li lectured, "The little bit of strength I managed to save up these past few days was used to protect your little life this morning. How could I still have any strength now? Do you think I'm one of those 2 deer that can't die from exhaustion?" Those 2 deer were by the lake not far away, resting with their front hooves bent. They seemed very docile. Speaking of which, that final strike you used to heavily injure He was pretty good. It was actually able to suddenly flick up when the sword energy was exhausted and directly reverse the situation. What kind of sword style was that to be so handsome? Chen Chongqing heard Su Li's question and was very speechless. He thought to himself, could it be that you can't tell what kind of sword style it was? But just like the conversation he and Su Li most often had, he knew that he had to answer. "It's the burning heaven sword." When he said these 3 words, he felt very embarrassed and his face revealed an embarrassed expression. However, Su Li's skin was clearly much thicker than his. He clicked his tongue and sighed in admiration. The person that can create this sword move is truly extraordinary. Chen Chongqing could not continue. He hugged his knees and lowered his head, pretending that he had not heard anything. The Burning Heaven sword was a secret sword of the Mount Li sword sect. Just like the Golden Crow sword, it was originally a sword style that Su Li had created. He was not willing to speak, so Su Li could not continue to brag. After a moment of silence, his expression became serious. He looked at him and asked expressionlessly, "Why do you know my Burning Heaven sword?" This was indeed a problem. Cultivation sects had always paid particular attention to not passing on their techniques to outsiders. Anyone who dared to steal would be pursued to death. Moreover, the Burning Heaven sword was not an ordinary sword technique of the Mount Li sword sect, but a secret technique created by Su Li. The Burning Heaven sword is recorded in the secrets of the Mount Li sword style. Chen Chongqing looked at Su Li's expression and nervously explained. Su Li recalled that before the Great War of several hundred years had ended, before he had finished his apprenticeship, and that he was still an ignorant little boy in the Mount Li sword sect. He had created this absolutely fierce sword style, and in the end, he could not resist the requests of his teachers, so he made a copy. He looked at Chen Chongqing expressionlessly and said, "So the secrets of my Mount Li's sword style are in your hands." The disciples of the Mount Li sword sect who had experienced the Ivy Festival and the Grand Examination, such as Go Hanshi, Guan Feibai, and the others, had long since confirmed this fact. However, Su Li had wandered the world and simply did not care about these matters, so this was the first time they had found out. When he said the secrets of the Mountly sword style, he stared into Chen Chongqing's eyes and enunciated his words particularly clearly and somewhat heavily. Chen Chongqing had studied in Xining Village's old temple since he was a child. After entering the Orthodox Academy, he was also alone, without any teachers or schoolmate. He basically did not have any concept of sex, so he naturally did not know the significance of the secrets of the Mountly sword style to Mountly. He nodded and said, "I learned Senior's Burning Heaven sword from there." Su Li's eyebrows twitched and he asked, "The secrets of the sword style only recorded the sword manual and the sword paths, but there is no way to circulate the sword essence. It only has the form, but not the spirit. How did you learn it?" Chen Chongqing honestly answered, "I designed 2 paths for true essence to circulate. After some calculations and deductions, as well as 2 moves, the power is definitely not as strong as Senior's true Burning Heaven sword, but it can still be used." Hearing these words, Su Li was silent for a very long time. Chen Chongqing asked, "Senior?" Su Li looked at him and said, "No wonder when I saw you use your sword, I felt it was a little strange. You designed it yourself. When did designing sword paths become such a simple matter? Don't tell me you're actually a true genius of the path of the sword?" Chen Chongqing did not dare to accept it. He said, "That was all Senior's wisdom. I just made some adjustments. Adjustments are sometimes even harder than creating them. I created the Burning Heaven sword when I was 14, and you changed the Burning Heaven sword when you were 15. I'm a peerless genius, so don't tell me you're an idiot? To be able to create your own path to circulate true essence, you're obviously a true genius, even a rare genius that only appears once in 1,000 years. It's just that those true idiots in the capital never discovered this matter that should have been the most important. I'm afraid that even Go Hanshi missed it." Su Li looked at him and said with a face full of praise, "Only those demi-humans whose meridians are different from humans, but whose hearts are set on cultivating the techniques of humans, can roughly understand how important the things you've done are. No wonder the White Emperor couple allowed their precious daughter to take you as her master, and even gave you the secrets of our Mountly sword style." Chen Chongqing had never felt that he was anything special, other than the fact that he was well versed in the Taoist canon. That was only because everyone said that Go Hanshi was very extraordinary in the Taoist canon. Only then did he know that he and Senior Yu Ren were also very extraordinary. Yet today there was someone who said that he was also extraordinary in the path of the sword and cultivation, even a rare genius. Moreover, the person who said this was a genius that was publicly acknowledged by the world. This made him very shocked, very happy, and also somewhat perplexed. Then he heard Su Li mention the secrets of the Mountly sword style again, and finally came to his senses. He said, "Senior, the secrets of the Mountly sword style were given to me by Luoluo, but it's not mine, so I can't give it to you." Su Li saw that he finally understood his meaning, and was just about to smile and extend his hand to receive the secrets of the Mountly sword style that Chen Chongqing respectfully returned to him, and thus comfort his master's spirit in heaven. Unexpectedly, the situation did not develop like this. He was very angry. He thought to himself, could it be that all those praises I gave you just now were all heard by a pig? Chen Chongqing saw that his expression was not good, and wanted to ease the atmosphere. He smiled and said, "Senior can't steal Junior's things." He really was not good with words. This joke was not funny. If Su Li could act now, he would definitely snatch the secrets of the Mountly sword style from him. Therefore, the atmosphere did not improve at all. Instead, it became even more awkward. "The secrets of my Mountly sword style were stolen by the White Emperor clan, so I will only take it back from their hands." Su Li looked at him and said. This sentence was said with a heroic spirit that reached the clouds, and the clouds broke the moon. but he knew it was just an excuse or a way out. At this moment, he couldn't even defeat Chen Chongqing, so he couldn't snatch it. He could only not snatch it and leave it for later. The problem was that Chen Chongqing did not know. He thought that Su Li really did think this way, so he curiously asked, "Senior, why haven't you gone to White Emperor City in these past few years to take back the secrets of the Mountly sword style?" In his view, given Su Li's cultivation and temperament on the path of the sword, since the secrets of the Mountly sword style had been lost in White Emperor City, Su Li should have long since killed his way over to search for them. Thus, by asking, he had also taken away the steps under Su Li's feet. Su Li's complexion was rather unsightly. He thought to himself that the praise he had given to this little thing was truly inferior to giving it to a pig. That's all for today. I'm going out to party with my friends tonight. I actually want to name this chapter Goddamn Dialogue. Chapter 372. Without a way out, he still had to descend the mountain. After being pushed against the wall by a single sentence, he still had to answer. Su Li looked at Chen Chongqing's eyes that were filled with curiosity and said with an ugly expression, "White Emperor City. I will go there sooner or later." How could the Mountly sword style remain in the demi-humans? Who would have thought that Bai Xingye would be so shameless that he actually married a wife? Chen Chongqing thought, what does marrying a wife have to do with being shameless? Only then did he understand Su Li's meaning. Su Li sneered, "I'm not afraid of Bai Xingye. If I say I'll fight, I'll fight. But the problem is, after he gets married, if we fight, it'll be 2 against 1. Not to mention anything else, it's too unfair." Chen Chongqing thought, to make enemies with 2 saints, even senior, you would find it troublesome and difficult to handle. Su Li glanced at him and opened his mouth to counterattack. "What's with those swords? Do you have anything you want to say?" In the morning, Chen Chongqing had used the Mountain Sea sword and a few other famous swords, so it was naturally impossible to hide them from Su Li's eyes. He was silent for a while, then told him about the important matters of the Garden of Zhou. He only left out some details, such as the 10 heavenly tome monoliths, the golden-winged Great Ping, and that white-clothed elf girl. "You actually hid so many things from me," Su Li said in a low voice as he looked at him. Chen Chongqing laughed somewhat embarrassedly and said, "Senior, everyone has their own secrets." Su Li mocked, "Only when you can hide a secret until your last breath can it be called a secret, but are you a liar?" Chen Chongqing thought, although I am not good at lying, I still have many secrets that no one knows, not even senior. For some reason, he actually felt a little proud. Su Li suddenly said without any warning, "From today onwards, I can only rely on you, little guy, so I changed my mind and decided to teach you a few moves. Don't misunderstand, this is the continuation of the conversation in the snowy mountains. Of course I support Qiushan, I'm just thinking of my own safety." Only now did Chen Chongqing confirm that after blocking Shui, he's blade in the morning, senior truly did not have the strength to fight. Listening to his explanation, he did not find it interesting, only sad, and also felt the pressure on his shoulders become much heavier. He did not want to see the carefree and unrestrained senior who dared to curse the heavens and the earth become so cautious, so he wanted the conversation to become more lively. "Senior is willing to teach me sword techniques because you value talent." He looked at Su Li and said seriously, "Because in the battle this morning, I proved that I have the qualifications to learn the sword." Su Li stared blankly, then laughed heartily. "Your narcissistic appearance really does have some of my elegance." Chen Chongqing thought to himself, this is all because of Tang 36's influence. Thinking of this, he could no longer suppress his longing for Jingdou and the people in it. It was very strange. After leaving Xining village, he would miss his master and senior Yu Ren, but he rarely thought of them. However, it had only been a month since he had left the capital, but he thought of the capital more than once every day. Under the great banyan tree in the Tradition Academy, Luoluo was standing shoulder to shoulder with him on the tree, Tang Tang was cursing at the sunset in the lake under the tree, Xian Yuan Po was cooking in the kitchen across the lake, Official Jean was in the distant gatehouse, and Bishop May was always asleep. Were they all well? And that young lady Chu Jian, are you all right? Chen Chongqing was anxious to return. He thought that he had to return alive, and return as soon as possible. He stood up and solemnly bowed to Su Li. He said sincerely, "Senior, please teach me sword techniques." Su Li looked at him and asked, "What sword techniques do you know?" Chen Chongqing stood up and gazed at the gradually darkening lake and the rising stars. He cleared his throat and said, "I know Mount Zhong's storm rising pale yellow, 800 swords crossing the river, Orthodox Academy's toppling mountain staff, unparalleled true sword of the orthodoxy, 13 willow branches, Snow Mountain sect's condensed frost. I also know Heavenly Tao Academy's sword of hithering light, Temple Seminary's sword of righteous will, Star Caesar Academy's sword of vanquishing army, Wenshui Tang's 3 forms of Wenshui and the Tang family's ancestral sword, Mount Li sword sects blossoming like brocade, Mountain Spirit splitting cliff, Law sword, welcoming guest sword, Mountain turning sword, burning heaven sword, South Stream Temple's 3 lanes of plum blossom, White crane comes from the west, ink great hanging. Lakeside was very quiet. Only the youth's clear and bright voice constantly rang out. The names of countless sword techniques danced on the water with the night wind, and no one knew when they would stop. Only when the numerous stars filled the night sky did someone finally break down. "Stop." Su Li looked at him and said, "Are you talking about speed recital?" Chen Chongqing was confused and asked, "Senior, what is speed recital?" The storytellers of Lin and City love to do crosstalk, and speed recital is the basic skill they practice. There's one that goes like this. "The dishes I make are roasted deer's tail, roasted bear's paw." Hey, why am I telling you this? Su Li was somewhat helpless. He waved his hand and said, "Anyway, that's enough. That's enough." What was enough? He had heard enough, and the sword techniques that Chen Chongqing knew were also enough. Chen Chongqing was very obedient and did not continue speaking. He only felt that he had not fully expressed himself. "Kid, you know quite a few sword techniques," Su Li looked at him and said, but the expression on his face was not only praise, but also very complicated. Chen Chongqing said honestly, "It's all rote memorization. I haven't been able to integrate them, so I don't dare to say that I've truly grasped them." Nonsense. If you want to grasp the true meaning of so many sword techniques, you'd have to start learning them 600 years before you were born. Su Li looked at him expressionlessly and said, "And there's also no need. Only those idiots would try to learn so many sword techniques." Chen Chongqing always felt that these words were cursing him. Su Li continued, "But this at least shows that you have enough knowledge and experience on the path of the sword. Then what I said today, you should be able to understand and not think that I'm cursing you." Chen Chongqing felt that these words were still cursing him. Su Li did not pause at all, nor did he give any hints. He began to teach. "All the experts of the world know that Shui, he is not as good as Wang Po. This morning, he asked me, and you also listened to my answer. He used 7 blades, so no matter what, he couldn't beat Wang Po's 1 blade. This has nothing to do with biting off more than one can chew, nor does it have anything to do with being distracted. It has to do with the essence of the sword." Chen Chongqing asked, "What is the essence of the sword?" Su Li pulled out the heaven-shrouding sword from the yellow paper umbrella and placed it across his knees. Pointing at it, he said, "What character does this look like?" This was the first time Chen Chongqing had closely observed this exceptionally famous sword that had actually followed him for a very long time. He was currently carefully examining it. Hearing the question, he said without even thinking, "It looks like the character 1. Su Li solemnly said, "Correct, the soul of the path of the sword lies in 1. Chen Chongqing was silent for a while, then said, "But, Senior, Didn't you say that the soul of the path of the sword lies in the sword? Su Li said angrily, can we still have a proper conversation? The next chapter might come rather late. Chapter 373. Chen Chongqing originally wanted to say what the soul of the path of the sword was, and how it had anything to do with the spear between Wang Po and Shui He's blade techniques, but seeing Su Li's angry appearance, he did not dare to say it. He obediently replied, I can. Then let's continue. The soul of the path of the sword lies in one. This time, when he said the word one, Su Li emphasized it, so it sounded very much like 100 million. Chen Chongqing earnestly asked for guidance. You mean cultivating the path of the sword requires wholehearted devotion? Su Li thought about it, then said, yes and no. Chen Chongqing thought about it, then said, then, is it yes or no? Su Li stared into his eyes and said, in short, remember one word as one. Chen Chongqing lowered his head again and said, yes. Everyone says that swordsmen are vicious weapons, and only saints can use them. Then this actually also means that swordsmen are also sacred weapons. Su Li calmly looked at the heaven-shrouding sword in his hand. His right hand gripped the hilt, while the index and middle fingers of his left hand slowly slid across the blade. He said, horizontally, the sword is the mountain range on the plains, the chains at the bottom of the great river. Straight, it is the arrows flying high in the sky, the raindrops falling from the sky. Downwards, it will open the earth and reveal the abyss of the yellow springs. Upwards, it will burn the heavens. The reason it's like this is because of its form and because of its intent. The form of the sword is one, and the intent of the sword is also one. Form and intent are one, and the soul is also one. No matter how many sword styles you know, it's still not as good as practicing one sword style to the extreme. Even if you have 10 million swords, you still have to choose one sword for yourself. Su Li looked at Chen Chongqing and said with a deeper meaning. Chen Chongqing seemed to be thinking, and really was thinking. Su Li's view on the path of the sword was actually not new. There were many similar records in the Taoist canon, but they did not conform to his ideas. Su Li said, of course, at the very beginning, you still have to learn a bit more and broaden your horizons. Only then can you pick out the most suitable ones and not be dazzled by them. Just like when I was 15, I already knew so many sword techniques that I couldn't even remember their names, which was why I was able to have my later achievements. In short, it's just like looking at mountains and rivers. It's a bit complicated, so try your best to understand it. Chen Chongqing didn't need to seriously experience it to understand the general idea, but this level of teaching was a bit too high. That was a matter for the future, but what should he do now? It had to be known that the assassin was currently hiding in the darkness of the night. Who knew how many strong enemies they would encounter on their way back to the south, and it was even possible that countless people were currently rushing towards them. Su Li looked at him and said, speaking of specific battles, your state is rather strange. There's clearly quite a lot of true essence in your body, but for some reason your output in battle is very terrible. Hearing these words, Chen Chongqing was so impressed that he prostrated himself on the ground. In the capital and the garden of Zhou, he had been mocked or pitted by many people, saying that his true essence was too thin. Only Su Li could see where his true problem lay. This truly was a very troublesome problem. He thought of Luo Luo and Nank's special innate bloodlines and the power they brought with their boundless true essence in battle, and he felt very envious. It was just that this problem involved the problem of the meridians in his body, so he could not explain it too clearly. He could only silently wait for Su Li's next words. The greatest characteristic of the star condensation realm is the existence of the star domain. If you want to break through the defense, you can either use a higher cultivation to directly suppress it, or use sword energy to crush it, or use a sufficient amount of true essence to forcefully attack a single point. Your cultivation is not enough, and the amount of true essence you can output through your sword techniques is not enough. Even if your sword is sharp enough, you still can't enter the world of others. Su Li glanced at Chen Chongqing's dagger and said, "It's a good thing that most of the star condensation experts on the continent are just in name. Their star domains are still very far from being perfect, so they all have weak points and flaws. If the opponent does not move, perhaps they can use their cultivation and aura to cover up those weak points and flaws, but as long as they move, they will definitely be seen through. So what you need to learn the most right now is how to see through the weak points of a star condensation opponent." Chen Chongqing thought of the battle in the morning and said, "Just like how Senior saw through Shui's flaws?" "Correct, but if you really wait until the opponent moves and then see through it, it will often be too late. So according to your current cultivation, the best method is to calculate ahead of time. Even if you have to guess a few positions as backup. How do I calculate? Age, cultivation, physical strength, body condition, most likely move, characteristics of the star domain, amount of true essence, background of the sect, cultural inheritance, characteristics of the region, eating habits, marital status, number of children." Senior, what does marital status have to do with the number of children? Married people will naturally have weaker courage, and their physical strength will also be weaker. What about the number of women? If they've just given birth, that person will definitely be brave and hard to defeat, because they have too much love and reluctance to part with this world. If they've already given birth to 7 children, that person is also very scary, because it's extremely likely that they don't fear death. If that's the case, being married for too long is also extremely scary. You're a typical summer bug. What's scary about that kind of opponent? You're probably thinking about suicide every day. Senior, can we talk about some serious matters? Don't make trouble for no reason. Who's making trouble for no reason? Su Li was indeed not making trouble for no reason. He had listed out 67 specific matters for Chen Chongqing. Whether it was age, cultivation, physical strength, body condition, sect background, or skin color, they were all significant in battle. According to what he said, if Chen Chongqing could truly learn this sword style, then he could very easily see through the flaws of a star condensation opponent. This sword style did not have any moves, nor did it require much true essence or cultivation. It only required intelligence and powerful calculation ability. Could give the wielder a pair of all-seeing eyes that could see through the world, so it was called the intellectual sword. The night was long and the stars were in the sky. Su Li used the sword as a brush, writing and drawing on the ground by the lake. He explained to Chen Chongqing the relationships and changes between these seemingly unrelated matters. Chen Chongqing gradually accepted the explanation regarding the intellectual sword. He listened very earnestly and attentively, his thoughts constantly turning, unwilling to miss a single word. After concluding the explanation of the intellectual sword, Su Li lay down between the 2 furry deer and began to sleep. Chen Chongqing sat by the lake. He did not sleep because he could not sleep. In front of his eyes was a dense mass of characters and an extremely complex process of calculation. He was good at rote memorization, but his ability in this aspect was truly very ordinary. Without sufficient intelligence, how could he learn the intellectual sword? He simply had no way of grasping this seemingly simple but actually extremely complex sword style. Just at this moment, he suddenly thought of that lady Chu Jian. In front of him, there seemed to be a white dress drifting on the surface of the lake. If it were her, with her outstanding talent in calculation and deduction, learning this sword style, she would probably be able to learn it very quickly. Chen Chongqing's current calculation ability is very ordinary, but his greatest advantage right now is that his database is large enough to store enough information. This month is the new year, so the updates will definitely be heavily affected. During the New Year period, there will definitely be a vacation. Everyone knows that this month, the number of updates will exceed 80,000. Yes, in March there will be a lot of updates. In addition, as for who is first on the ranking of assassins, some friends are very concerned, so let's have a contest on WeChat. There will definitely be people who can guess it. Haha, I can only use these 2 words to express my current mood. Chapter 374. If one viewed the intellectual sword as a question, this question had too many initial conditions, too many parameters, and too much information. Even confirming it was extremely difficult, not to mention calculating the final result. Chen Chongqing confirmed that he could not complete this sort of calculation, at least not in the middle of an intense battle. He even began to doubt whether anyone could complete this sort of calculation. However, Su Li had already proven in the battle in the morning that he could at least do it. Su Li was obviously not an ordinary person, but if he could do it, it meant that this matter could be done. The night lake and the distant mountains were right in front of him. He very quickly shook off his discouraged and fearful mood. He thought about how he could memorize all the directions of the Yesher step and use them. Even if he did not have the talent to calculate and see through people's minds, he might still be able to use this stupid method to reach his goal. If he did not have time to calculate in battle, then he would first do countless questions until he could turn this sort of calculation into instinct. Perhaps he could really save some time. But how could he do countless questions in advance? If he returned to the capital, it might be possible, but where could he find so many star condensation experts to fight? And even if he could not solve those questions, would he be killed by his opponent? He noticed that there were countless specks of light in the night lake in front of him. Those were the reflections of the stars. He raised his head and gazed at the night sky. He saw the countless stars on the pitch-black curtain, quietly looking at him. Humans, divine race, are the world's most complex research subjects, because they have different levels of intelligence, different life experiences, and their emotional changes and mental activities are more in a random state. As a result, the final objective appearance that they present is all different. It is incomparably complex, and only our vast starry sky can compare. Many years ago, the most knowledgeable pope, who had made the greatest contribution to humanity's knowledge, sighed at the starry sky. It was recorded in the ancient records of the Orthodoxy. In that era there was also a demon scholar, Tongus. When he traveled south to Snowhold Pass and saw the sky full of stars, he also said similar words in shock. Looking at the starry sky, Chen Chongqing thought of these words. He sensed the red star that belonged to him in the distance, invisible to the naked eye. Then he raised his right hand and pointed at a certain region of stars in the night sky. From there, he plucked a star chart and placed it in front of his eyes. Of course, this was just an image, not something that actually happened. On the last night of viewing the monoliths in the Mausoleum of Books, he had combined the lines of the 17 monoliths of the front mausoleum together, forming a star chart. It was the one before his eyes. This star atlas was only an extremely small part of the entire starry sky, but there were hundreds of millions of stars on it, emitting either bright or dark rays of light in front of his eyes. It seemed solemn, eternal, and motionless. But he knew that these stars were moving at every moment. Every star represented a condition. A moving star meant that the star was undergoing a change. For example, the growth of age, the exhaustion of physical strength, the decline of courage, and the gradual emergence of the desire to die. If the traces in the starry sky represented fate, then the changes in these stars represented the changes in many factors that determine fate. The combination of the orbits of the stars was destiny. Everything was within it. Even the star domain of a star condensation cultivator could not surpass this range. The movement of the stars was like the movement of qi. The brightness of the stars was like the strength of qi. Any condition, any information, could be simulated by the orbits of the stars. However, those conditions were more realistic and not as mysterious. Or, to put it simply, those conditions could be calculated and observed. If one could see the vast starry sky in a concise manner, If one could find a way out from the sky full of stars, then one could naturally find the weak point of a cultivator's star domain. However, the stars were moving, and the many factors that made up a cultivator's body were also constantly changing. Then how could one obtain the final and clear result? It did not take long for Chen Chongqing to understand. Just like this star chart, the position of a star did not mean that the star would always be there. Instead, in hundreds of millions of years, it was the place that it most often appeared. This was a question of probability. A star was most likely to appear at a certain place, so it was there. A sword would most likely stab at a certain place, so it would stab at a certain place. A star domain would most likely change however it was most likely to change. This was very difficult to clearly describe with words, but he understood. Then he began to solve the problem for the first time. The first time he cultivated the intellectual sword, he did not slash at a star condensation opponent, but at the entire starry sky. He calmly gazed at the starry sky, countless streams of light flashing through his bright and clear eyes. Each stream of light was a condition, or perhaps a parameter. He earnestly recorded everything before his eyes, then calculated until he was entranced. At 5 a.m, Chen Chongqing opened his eyes. He did not sleep for the entire night. The positions of the countless stars were gradually branded into his sea of consciousness, and those extremely complex calculations made him consume countless amounts of spiritual sense and energy. Yet for some reason, he did not feel tired. As the morning breeze caressed his face, he even felt somewhat refreshed. He had already touched upon the true meaning of the intellectual sword. Of course, he was keenly aware that he was still many nights away from truly grasping the intellectual sword. Su Li leaned against the warm body of the furry deer. He looked at him with some surprise and then began to laugh. In the following nights, Chen Chongqing continued to observe the starry sky and polish his intellectual sword that had not even taken its embryonic form. Su Li did not give him any more instructions. Every night, he slept very soundly, but he purposefully slowed down the speed of his journey south. Su Li was keenly aware that he was currently at a very crucial moment. If he really could grasp the intellectual sword, then when he faced off against star condensation opponents in the future, he might really be able to catch them off guard and obtain victory, so he would rather sacrifice a bit of speed. Yes, whether it was Su Li who had passed on the sword or Chen Chongqing who had learned the sword, they had always limited the opponents they could encounter on the journey south to star condensation. This was because cultivators below the star condensation realm were basically no match for Chen Chongqing. And if the opponent really was above the star condensation realm, those old monsters of the Saint realm, what meaning was there in sharpening the sword just before the battle? If the situation continued to develop like this, perhaps in another few dozen nights, Chen Chongqing really might be able to borrow the starry sky to wash and polish his intellectual sword into shape. Regretfully, this world could not give the heavily injured Su Li so much time. Even more regretfully, Chen Chongqing's opponent had finally appeared. Before the battle, no matter how one looked at it, there was no time for the meticulous work of sharpening the sword. There were still tens or even thousands of nights before Chen Chongqing would be able to create the intellectual sword. On a certain day in the middle of spring, on a barren mountain 200 miles away from Tianliang County, an extremely bewitching man appeared. The man wore lipstick and wore a dancing dress. He looked just like a dancer. In short, he was just like Shui He from a few days ago. No matter how one looked at him, he did not seem like an assassin. Chen Chongqing asked in confusion, why did they not seem like assassins when they appeared? Or is it to say, to become an outstanding assassin, one must not look like an assassin? Is this the creed of an assassin? The creed of an assassin? What nonsense are you talking about? Su Li said mockingly. Do you think they would be happy to appear with such a ghastly appearance? It's just that they came in such a hurry that they didn't have time to change their clothes. Apologies, the update is a bit late. Recently, my time and energy have really been a bit too much. Tomorrow's update will definitely be very, very late. Chapter 375. Other than those Avengers who were determined to die, no one dared to kill Suli. This was because everyone in the world knew that they could not defeat him, so they naturally could not kill him. Thinking about it, killing him would only bring disgrace upon oneself, bring about one's own death. There was no other conclusion. But now, the situation had changed. He had been besieged by the devil race for several days and nights, and even though he had luckily escaped, he was still seriously injured. For those who wanted to kill him, this was undoubtedly the best opportunity, and an opportunity that must be seized. When Shuehi found out that Suli was heavily injured, he had been patrolling the military stronghold in the lower city. Before he had even taken off his armor, he had been pushed around by several of his subordinates to drink quite a bit of wine. While his face was red and his ears were hot, he suddenly received this news. Without even thinking about it, he flipped his hand and threw away the night light, splashed some wine, and knocked out 2 officers who still wanted to urge him to drink. Riding the red cloud Chilan, he charged into the snowy plains. He only thought about finding Suli as quickly as possible and then killing Suli. How could he care about anything else? Now, the man who appeared in the barren mountain was the same. 4 days ago, he had been in the estate of Xuanyang City singing an opera to entertain himself. He had invited the best troupe in Lanling City, and only a few of his closest and most powerful guests were present. He was singing the famous Spring Night Song, playing the part of a charming and pleasant bride. Just as he was singing excitedly, his eyebrows flying and his eyes softening, he suddenly saw the bishop sitting below him give him a meaningful glance, and soon after, he heard a message. Suli was heavily injured, so he might be in the north of Tianliang County? He sucked in a breath of cold air and squinted at the sky, his eyes filled with indescribable contempt and sorrow. After a few moments of silence, the only thing that could be heard from the stage was the clattering of a board. He leaped off the stage, kicked off his cloud boots, threw away his headscarf, seized the lightning horse of the Xuanyang City Guard, and then left the city, galloping straight to the county's north. Chen Chongqing had said that they did not seem like assassins because they had never been assassins. Moreover, it was just as Suli had said. They were in a hurry, and they were very afraid that they would not make it in time. Something like Suli being heavily injured might not happen even once in his entire life, so how could he have the time to change clothes? Thus, Shuehi's armor shone brightly, while the man's dancing clothes fluttered in the wind. He still had remnants of makeup on, and was wearing his usual clothes. Of course, he didn't look like an assassin. Shuehi's bright armor was covered in dust, and this man's dancing clothes were also covered in mud. His expression was a bit tired and haggard, and the red makeup that had not been completely blown away by the wind gave him a bewitching and charming feeling. As he looked at Suli, his eyes grew brighter and brighter, and the smile on his face grew thicker and thicker. Lifting his sleeve to cover his lips, he was extremely charming, extremely proud, yet there was also a pain that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. After so much trouble, I've finally found you. It really wasn't easy. However, thinking about how you're going to die by my hand soon, no matter how much trouble I put in, it's nothing. To be able to meet you in the 3,000 li of northern plains, I have to say that my luck is pretty good. Hearing these words, Suli also felt somewhat sorrowful. He said to Chen Chongqing, "Your luck is really good. You just happened to need an opponent stronger than you, but not by too much, and now one has appeared." With his eyes, he could easily tell that this man was at the initial level of star condensation. The man slightly raised his eyebrows and said with some surprise, "You don't know who I am?" Chen Chongqing nodded his head honestly. The man lightly lifted his sleeve and softly introduced himself. "I am Liang Hongzhuang." Liang Hongzhuang was famous. In Tianliang County and even the entire northern continent, He was very famous because of his family background, because of that elder brother of his, because many people knew that he liked to sing, liked to dance, and because he was very strong. Chen Chongqing and Su Li looked at each other, still not knowing who he was. Regarding the Taoist canon, Chen Chongqing could recite it backwards, but regarding the real world of cultivation, he was truly ignorant and inexperienced. As for Su Li, there were very few people on this continent that required him to remember their names. It was very clear that Liang Hongzhuang had not reached that level. Without a doubt, this was an extremely great humiliation. Liang Hongzhuang frowned, but he did not get angry. He sighed. It hurts my pride a little, but if I can kill Sir Su, perhaps even more people will know my name. Chen Chongqing said, Could it be you came to kill people just to become famous? Liang Hongzhuang did not answer, only smiled. Su Li suddenly asked, Liang from Liang Wangsun? Liang Hongzhuang's expression became slightly solemn. Liang from Liang Hongzhuang. When Su Li heard this, he understood why this deranged fellow wearing a red wedding dress wanted to kill him. He turned to Chen Chongqing and said, He really wants to kill me, so you have to kill him. Chen Chongqing heard this short conversation. He did not completely understand it, but he could roughly guess something. This assassin wearing a red dancing dress presumably had some relationship with Liang Wangsun. Seeing Liang Hongzhuang get closer and closer, seeing the ribbons of the dancing dress gently swaying in the wind, his brain quickly turned, incessantly observing, analyzing and calculating, attempting to find a flaw in the dancing dress. To defeat your opponent, you first had to understand your opponent. Whether it was the intellectual sword or the most ordinary of battles, they all had this requirement. He did not know who this dancer called Liang Hongzhuang was, but he knew of Liang Wangsun. Liang Wangsun was an expert ranked extremely high on the Proclamation of Liberation, a true celebrity. What kind of celebrity could be called a true celebrity? If even an ignorant and inexperienced fellow like Chen Chongqing had heard of him, then he was a true celebrity. Chen Chongqing did not have a very good understanding of the sex of the cultivation world, but he had a very good understanding of the Liang clan. Because the Liang clan was the former imperial clan, their cultivation, lifestyle, and bloodline inheritance were all recorded in the ancient records of the orthodoxy. Liang Wangsuan's luxurious and extravagant style, Liang Wangsuan's techniques, Liang Wangsuan's style of swordsmanship, Liang Wangsuan's attitude towards Wang Pu and Xiao Zhang, Liang Wangsuan's age, Liang Wangsuan's 3 wives, countless fragments of information floated up from the bottom of his sea of consciousness in an extremely short amount of time, then quickly flashed before his eyes. Just like the myriad stars in that region of stars, they arrived before his eyes from the night sky and began to twinkle. He wanted to find the most crucial blank space in these stars, that passage. Can it work? Su Li asked. Chen Chongqing shook his head. His intellectual sword had not yet been sharpened. No, it should be said that the sword billets had not even taken shape. It was simply impossible to see through the flaws of a star condensation cultivator, so how could it be used against an enemy? Even if you can't see it, you still have to guess. Senior, since you can, why can't you guide me like last time? I said it before, in order to block Shui's blade, I used up all the strength I had saved up. If you want to see through the star domain, do you need strength? Or else? I always feel that it doesn't make sense. Wait until you have the chance to be so tired that you can't even open your eyes. Only then will you have the qualifications to understand this principle. Fine, then what do we do next? If I say so, then guess it. Guess. That's a guess. As he spoke, Liang Hongzhuang had already arrived in front of the two. Chen Chongqing could no longer care so much. His dagger left its sheath like a bolt of lightning, stabbing towards the other end of the fluttering belt. On a distant hillside, 2 furry deer were currently eating grass with their heads lowered, not even glancing in their direction. Apologies, I'll only write this chapter today. I'm too busy. 2 chapters tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, I'll return to Hubei. I'll be flying for an entire day, so I'll take a day off. Regarding the intellectual sword, there's one saying that it's Dai Zongfu, and another saying that it's Bai Qi. Those who understand will understand, and those who don't, I recommend everyone to read Jin Yong's novels and Tale of Charm. I only found out in the last 2 years that there are actually many young friends who have never read Jin Yong's original work. Regarding this, I express my deep anxiety. Also, in Charm I like Bai Qi the most. Chapter 376. To the furry deer, the battle between Chen Chongqing and Liang Hongzhuang was not as attractive as the grass. If there were other spectators, they would probably think the same, because there was a great disparity in strength between the two sides, and because the last of Su Li's strength had been used to block Xue He's blade. But for some reason, the only spectator present, Su Li, was completely focused on the battle, not even blinking. Liang Hongzhuang was dressed in red dancing clothes, ribbons fluttering around his body. The qi of a star condensation expert danced with him, traveling everywhere. This was a complete, even perfect domain. It was impossible to see any flaws. Chen Chongqing could not see it, but just like what Su Li had said to him at the end, even if it was a guess, even if it was a wild guess, he still had to do it, he still had to gamble. Of course, since it was a guess, since it was a wild guess, there was no hope of winning the gamble. The only advantage he had was that he was not like other ethereal opening cultivators, who had no understanding of the star condensation realm. Back in the Orthodox Academy, when he thought that he had failed in purification, he had actually succeeded. When he thought that he did not dare to enter meditative introspection, he was actually already guiding starlight into ethereal opening. When he was viewing the monoliths in the front mausoleum, he had folded the lines of the heavenly tome monoliths into a star chart. This method was originally star condensation. He was an anomaly in the cultivation world, forever cultivating through methods that surpassed his current cultivation level. In other words, on the path of cultivation, he did not walk faster than others, but he could see further. He knew what star condensation was. Cultivators guided starlight into purification. Meditative introspection transformed star radiance into true essence, and then borrowed the power of the starlight to open the door to ethereal palace. What they needed to do next was to continue guiding starlight into their bodies, lighting up the stars on the spirit mountain, matching those stars with their own acupuncture points, stimulating their true essence, drawing their own star chart, reconstructing the miniature world in their bodies. Externally, that was the star domain. The star domain was the world of star condensation cultivators. It was the projection of the starry sky in the cultivator's body and sea of consciousness. The true starry sky was tranquil and eternal, solemn and dignified. According to common cultivation knowledge, the star domain of a star condensation cultivator should also be perfect, without any flaws. Even the nothingness that cultivators of higher cultivation could see through was not true nothingness, but because the cultivator's cultivation was limited, they could not perfectly control their spiritual sense and true essence. Chen Chongqing did not believe this. He believed that there was no such thing as a perfect star domain, because the real star domain was not a perfect and unchanging existence. It was because the real star domain was a dynamic equilibrium. Since it was a dynamic equilibrium, once an external force was introduced, this equilibrium would be broken at a certain moment. It sounded like Su Li had used to guide him in breaking Xue He's blade domain, but in his Li's blade. This Su Chen's Dao had even surpassed Su Li's sword domain. It was just that right now, neither Su Li nor he himself knew just what he had understood, just what he had discovered. Naturally, he could not imagine just what sort of changes this Dao domain would bring to his future cultivation and battles, and even the history of the entire world of cultivation. Seeing Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes, countless fragments of information flashed through Chen Chongqing's sea of consciousness at high speed. He incessantly calculated and sensed the qi attached to those ribbons, as well as the abnormally distinct ripples of true essence in the barren mountain. It was like he could see countless stars appear before his eyes. No one could clearly see the relative positions of these stars in such a short amount of time, and even more so, no one could calculate the laws of movement in this star domain through the brightness and relative positions of these stars in such a short amount of time, and thus find the weakest point in this star domain. The ability of humans to calculate had a limit. At this time, it was necessary to give way to those abilities that did not have a limit. For example, intuition. Of course, it could still be called guesswork. The several hundred stars were bright and dark, changing colors in his sea of consciousness. They clearly did not move, but he seemed to see those stars move. Humans were the combination of all relationship. Fate was the general theory of the trajectories between humans. The starry sky was the canvas that described and explained everything. Liang Hongzhuang's person was constantly changing. With each passing year, he aged at a rate of 1 year. With each additional jar of strong alcohol he drank, he became slower and slower. With each passing moment, he became more and more pained. Thus, his star domain was naturally also constantly moving. The stars moved, the brightness changed, and a new painting was born. Faintly, in that star domain that was densely packed with stars, he suddenly saw a patch of darkness. The surrounding stars seemed to turn into a path, and that patch of darkness was the end of the path. He did not know where it led to, but it might be nothingness. Chen Chongqing did not know what it was, and he could not be sure if what he saw was real or not, because in this star domain, there were many similar places. But at this moment, he could only believe in himself. Even if it was a guess, he had to believe it to be true. He thrusted his sword towards that position. There was a soft swish. The slightly cold air in the barren mountain was pierced. The red ribbon fluttered incessantly. Chen Chongqing's sword was clearly about to stab into the ribbon, but it mysteriously disappeared and then reappeared somewhere else. Su Li's expression turned slightly cold, his sword-like eyebrows slightly raised. Such a fast sword. It was actually able to break through Liang Hongzhuang's star domain. Such a fast sword. Liang Hongzhuang actually did not have any reaction. A clear whistle rose up from the mountains. Liang Hongru hurriedly retreated, only stopping when he was more than 10 zhang away. The red ribbon slowly floated down, falling at his feet. His left ear had been studded with a pearl. At this moment, that pearl had already disappeared, leaving behind only a dark red bead of blood. Chen Chongqing's sword had pierced his left ear, piercing that pearl. Liang Hongzhuang raised his hand and touched his left ear. His hand was slightly wet, and he frowned at Chen Chongqing. Besides shock, he was also very confused. He was actually able to break through his star domain? Just who was this youth? Surpassing levels to fight wasn't something inconceivable, but most of it happened between cultivators of the same level. For example, a cultivator at the lower level of ethereal opening could attempt to challenge a cultivator at the upper level of ethereal opening. But meditation challenging ethereal opening challenging star condensation, this kind of challenge that surpassed an entire level was extremely rare. Even in the tens of thousands of years of history, there weren't many successful cases. Of course, there would definitely be exceptions, such as those geniuses with extraordinary bloodlines. When Qiu Shanjun was still at ethereal opening, which cultivator at the initial stage of star condensation dared to say that they could definitely defeat him? Another example would be when Chen Chongqing left the capital. Luo Luo hadn't reached ethereal opening, but which cultivator at ethereal opening, including him, dared to say that she was inferior to him? But Chen Chongqing clearly didn't have any special bloodline. His true essence was very ordinary, and his aura was also very ordinary. Liang Hongzhuang suddenly thought of a possibility and asked, "Could it be that you are?" Chen Chongqing clasped his sword in greeting and said, "Orthodox Academy, Chen Chongqing." The next chapter will be slightly later. I have to pack my luggage, send the cat back to my parents' home, and celebrate the little new year. Oh, I almost forgot. I wish everyone a happy little new year. Chapter 377. Liang Hongzhuang's expression slightly shivered, his extremely thin eyebrows that had been drawn raised upwards. The youngest principal of Orthodox Academy, the object of the Orthodoxy's nurturing, the Pope and Archbishop Meili Shah's most favored junior, so it was this youngster. He knew of Chen Chongqing, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to guess, but there were a few things that he couldn't understand, for example, Chen Chongqing reaching the upper stage of ethereal opening at the tender age of 16, even his distant cousin that he wasn't very close to felt it was inconceivable. He also greatly admired him, but he couldn't understand Chen Chongqing's previous strike. Everyone knew that Chen Chongqing's talent lay in Xiuxing, in the perseverance, diligence, and comprehension hidden in the 4 words thoroughly read the scripture of the way, but his bloodline talent was very ordinary. It couldn't compare to Qiu Shanjun, Su Yurong, and Her Highness Luo Luo. Then, how could his sword strike surpass the boundary between ethereal opening and star condensation, and directly break through his star domain? Could it be that he had already seen through her dancing clothes before he had attacked? Liang Hongzhuang gazed at Su Li. The star domain of the star condensation realm seemed perfect, but in the end it was not truly perfect. However, only a powerful expert on Su Li's level could see through it. But previously, Su Li had not made a sound, and his gaze had always been on Chen Chongqing's sword, not on Liang Hongzhuang. What kind of sword did you use? Liang Hongzhuang looked at the short sword in Chen Chongqing's hand. His thin eyebrows raised even higher, becoming even more bewitching. Chen Chongqing did not know how to answer this question. When Su Li had taught him the sword, he had said very clearly that this sword style should be counted as part of the intellectual sword, but he had always felt that there was a faint difference between the two. At this time, Su Li also asked a question. He looked at Chen Chongqing and asked with a confused and doubtful expression, "You really guessed it?" Chen Chongqing nodded and said honestly, "I guessed." Su Li's eyes lit up, as if it was the first time he had seen this youth. He continued to ask, "Probability?" Chen Chongqing calculated in his mind and said uncertainly, 7? Su Li's voice suddenly grew louder. 70%? Even though his talent in the path of the sword was unparalleled in the world, he still felt that this answer was far too shocking. Whether it was several hundred years ago when he was learning the sword at Mount Li or when Qiu Jun first learned the intellectual sword with him, neither of them had been able to accomplish this feat. This was impossible. Yes, so it can happen. Chen Chongqing was a little embarrassed and said in a low voice, "I said 7%. Su Li thought to himself, this is more like it. Even so, Chen Chongqing's performance had already exceeded his prediction. He sighed and said, "Enough. At least you've left the category of guessing and arrived at guessing." Chen Chongqing was confused and asked, "What's the difference between guessing and guessing?" Su Li said, "Guessing requires evidence. Guessing is blindly messing around, so of course it's different." Chen Chongqing thought back to the feeling he had in the moment before he attacked with his sword. He suddenly couldn't tell if he was guessing or just guessing. His sword didn't rely on calculation, but intuition. Most of the time, intuition was an instinctive reaction produced after a lot of calculation and practice. He faintly felt that his attack, the way he had broken through Liang Hongzhuang's dancing dress, was slightly different from the intellectual sword that Su Li had taught him, but he did not know what this difference was. Liang Hongzhuang stood over 100 feet away, watching the conversation between the two of them. He suddenly laughed, his beautiful face, which still had remnants of makeup, filled with ridicule. "You're already chatting?" Su Li looked at him and said, "You want to talk? Let's go together then." Liang Hongzhuang stared blankly, not expecting to hear this sort of answer. After a moment of silence, he actually really did join in the conversation. This was because he had some things he wanted to say to Chen Chongsheng. As for Su Li, he had nothing good to say. He looked at Chen Chongsheng and said, "Why did you appear in the north of Tianliang County? Why did you travel with this demon? Why do you want to help him?" In the capital, the impression Chen Chongsheng had of Su Li was, for the most part, the image of the junior martial uncle of Mount Li, an unworldly expert. In this journey of 10,000 li, he realized that this impression was not accurate, or perhaps it was not enough to describe it. Su Li himself had admitted that he had killed many people, but this was the first time he had heard someone so directly denounce Su Li as a demon. "Do you know how many people he's killed? Do you know how many times his sword has been bathed in blood for it to be so sharp?" Liang Hongzhuang looked at Chen Chongsheng and said with slight ridicule, "He's killed so many people. He should have died long ago, but he still hasn't died. The cycle of the heavenly Tao and retribution has arrived. Now, he has finally welcomed the day of his death, but you still want to protect him?" Chen Chongsheng said nothing, because he did not know what to say. Liang Hongzhuang straightened his dancing clothes and walked over again. "He's a southerner and you're a Zhou. He's killed so many Zhou people, so what reason do you have to help him?" This did not seem like a problem, but in reality, if one carefully thought about it, it truly was a problem. On the snowy plains, Chen Chongsheng had carried Su Li on his back as they fled. It could be said that he was repaying Su Li for saving his life, and only Su Li could help him return. But now, after traversing 10,000 li of the snowy plains, no matter how many times he had saved his life, he had already repaid him. Now that he had returned to the Great Zhou, he could completely safely leave. Mount Li was strong because of Su Li, and the people of the Orthodoxy were strong because of the Orthodoxy. Right now, Su Li was like a heavily wounded lion in distress, and as long as the Orthodoxy was not destroyed, with Chen Chongsheng's status as the principal of the Orthodox Academy and the rumored appreciation of him by the Pope and Archbishop Melisha, who would dare do anything to him? As long as he was willing to leave, whether it was Xue He, Liang Hongzhuang, or those experts that would come later, they would all immediately send him back to the capital. No matter how one looked at it, there was no reason for him to continue standing at Su Li's side. Chen Chongsheng glanced at Su Li. Su Li's expression was indifferent. He did not say anything, because this was also a question that he had always wanted to understand. It was just that he did not ask, so Chen Chongsheng naturally did not answer. Now that Liang Hongzhuang had asked, he wanted to hear just what Chen Chongsheng's answer was. Chen Chongsheng was silent for a while, then said, "I inexplicably arrived in front of Xuelao City from the Garden of Zhou." Liang Hongzhuang slightly raised his brows. He had not expected it to be like this. "When I was in the Garden of Zhou, I thought I was doomed. When I left the Garden of Zhou and saw that Xuelao City, I also thought I was doomed. Then, Senior Su Li saved me, and I also thought that Senior being surrounded and killed by the demons might have something to do with that plot I encountered in the Garden of Zhou. Fine, it's actually not that complicated. The reason is actually very simple. Senior saved me, so I naturally could not watch him die." Chen Chongsheng looked at Liang Hongzhuang and seriously explained. Su Li said, "Your life has long since been repaid for the 10,000 li of snowy plains and Xue He's blade. Senior, accounts can't be calculated like this. To be more precise, there's no way to calculate accounts for things like lives." Chen Chongsheng clearly understood his own intentions, and his words also became more fluent. "To Senior, you only saved my life, but to me, this life is all I have." Su Li and Liang Hongzhuang understood the meaning of these words, but as people who had lived in the world of cultivation for many years, their bodies and minds were all dust, it was very difficult for them to accept this sort of reasoning. Su Li shook his head. "I believe that you no longer owe me anything." Chen Chongsheng said, "I don't think so." Su Li was a little taken aback. He was very clear that Chen Chongqing wasn't an admirer of his, and they didn't share the same interests, let alone a friendship despite the difference in age. That was why he was curious as to why Chen Chongqing didn't leave. Only at this moment did he realize that it was because of such a simple reason. Of course, a person who could persist in such a reason was truly not simple. A life in the eyes of others is actually all you have. Then how are you prepared to repay me? Don't tell me you're prepared to guard me for the rest of your life, to be my ox or horse. Su Li looked at him and said with slight ridicule, but his eyes were somewhat warm. Chen Chongqing said with slight embarrassment, "There's no need to be like this, right?" Su Li began to laugh, and Liang Hongzhuang also began to laugh. One was gratified, one was ridiculing, each with different meanings. Even if we really wanted to settle accounts, saving each other once could cancel it out. I still don't believe that it's already been repaid. Chen Chongqing looked at Liang Hongzhuang and said, "I want to repay the debt of saving my life, so I have to confirm that Senior is truly safe and that his life is not in danger before I can leave. It's just like a sick person on his last breath in the water. If you save him from the river, but ignore his illness and leave just like that, how can it be considered as you saving him?" Liang Hongzhuang thought it over, then said, "That's reasonable." Chen Chongqing said, "Many thanks for your understanding." Looking at Liang Hongzhuang's face that was as beautiful as a woman's and his red dancing clothes, he really did not know how to address him. Liang Hongzhuang looked at him and calmly said, "I want to avenge my father's death. Is that not also very reasonable?" Chen Chongqing was silent for a while, then nodded. Revenge for one's father's death was a reason that no one could refute. It was the highest reason. Since you insist on saving him, then I can only kill you. Liang Hongzhuang said, "After this, even if His Holiness the Pope condemns me, it's only death that settles it. You know that I'm not afraid." Chen Chongqing knew that to this kind of person who sought revenge, once they made up their mind, the dignity of the orthodoxy would not be able to change their minds. He said, "I understand." Liang Hongzhuang's qi grew more and more severe. Without the ribbons, his dancing clothes gently fluttered in the mountain wind. His star domain was even more stable and powerful than before. He looked at Chen Chongqing expressionlessly and said, "Do you have any last words?" Chen Chongqing sincerely said, "I hope that Your Excellency will be lenient. Tomorrow I have to fly for an entire day, so I have to seize the opportunity. Seize the opportunity to ask for a day off. Of course, the opportunity here is very bitter. I wish everyone a happy new year." The last sentence of this chapter is the best. Chapter 378. Liang Hongzhuang had rushed over thousands of li to find Su Li for revenge. He had said very clearly that this was the death of his father. Since this was the case, this battle would not be decided by victory or defeat, but by life or death. Before a battle of life and death, he asked his opponent to be lenient, and in such a sincere manner that it was not just words, but a request from the heart. Chen Chongqing's words were truly surprising. Liang Hongzhuang did not know how to respond, so he shook his head. However, what happened next was not surprising at all, because there was no such thing as leniency. The red dancing dress fluttered in the blue barren mountain, and the dust and earth within several hundred li were all shaken into the sky. Liang Hongzhuang floated over, like a real ball of fire, about to start a prairie fire. It was hard to find anything in the world that could spread faster and more violently than fire. Could this young man see through his domain? I was so fast that I couldn't even see clearly, so how could you see through it? Logically speaking, with Liang Hongzhuang's cultivation and reputation in the north, he should not have needed to use this kind of method against an ethereal opening cultivator. However, Chen Chongqing was not a normal ethereal opening cultivator, and in order to kill Su Li, Liang Hongzhuang was even willing to endure humiliation. Of course, he did not care about being a little more cautious, even if it was a completely unnecessary caution. For a star condensation cultivator to be so cautious when facing an opponent clearly weaker than himself was a very frightening thing. Seeing the red dancing dress that burned the barren mountain like a flame, Su Li's sword-like eyebrows rose again, but his expression became a little more indifferent. This indifference was indifference, indifference to life, indifference to the end. He could already see the end of this battle. Chen Chongqing had previously injured Liang Hongzhuang's earlobe with his sword, but he had no way of dealing with the current situation. Several hundred years ago, when he last left the Garden of Zhou, he was already at the peak of ethereal opening. Even at that time, when facing the current Liang Hongzhuang, he could not think of a better way to deal with him other than exchanging a kill for a kill. What could Chen Chongqing do? Chen Chongqing did not know what to do. No matter how high his comprehension was, no matter how diligent he was in cultivation, the difference in cultivation levels still existed. Moreover, in terms of battle, Liang Hongzhuang's experience was far greater than his, and it came too quickly. It was very difficult for anything to be more violent and faster than an encroaching fire. His ethereal opening realm cultivation simply had no way of keeping up with Liang Hongzhuang's speed, but he had two things that were faster than Liang Hongzhuang: the Yesher step and the speed of thought. With a single movement of his divine sense, he could cross thousands of mountains and rivers. He looked at the dancing costumes that covered the mountains and plains like fire, thinking hard. The old events of the previous dynasty recorded in the Taoist canons, the characteristics of Liang Wangsuan's method of rampaging through the north, Liang Hongzhuang's callous gaze, his terrifying red sleeves, his explosively rising qi, his boundless true essence, the angle at which a blade of grass would bend after being stepped on, and countless numbers or descriptions appeared in his sea of consciousness. Then, they constantly combined and matched with each other, forming an extremely complex star chart. His intellectual sword had yet to form. Even if he was given another 3 days and 3 nights, he would not be able to calculate the weak points of Liang Hongzhuang's star domain, nor would he be able to clearly see the connections within this star atlas. And after a while, Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes would burn him to ashes. He could only guess. Su Li had said that guessing and guessing were different. Guessing was a blind guess, but when guessing, one had to keep one's eyes open, look at the world, look at the starry sky, have a basis, and then listen to one's intuition, or the feeling in one's heart. He made his own guess, and then took the initiative to move. There was wind in the barren mountain, all coming from Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes, but the area around Chen Chongqing was very quiet, strange, and terrifying. Suddenly, he disappeared from his original position. In the next moment, he was in front of Liang Hongzhuang. He used a simplified version of the Yesher step. An extremely bright and beautiful sword glow lit up the barren mountain, accompanied by a low chant. Carrying with it a solemn and terrifying pressure that seemed to originate from ancient times, it pierced into the flames that covered the mountains and plains. He used the new generation of the Dragoncry sword. Compared to the powerful domain of Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes, his sword intent was not powerful, but it was especially awe-inspiring. The sword glow suddenly illuminated the mountains and plains, like a bolt of lightning. The dagger moved at an unimaginable angle, straight and abruptly turning, bypassing the flames that filled the sky and arriving in front of Liang Hongzhuang. A clear howl that was filled with anger and shock resounded through the mountains and plains. Liang Hongzhuang hastily retreated. Even though he was in midair, one could clearly see that a clear sword mark had appeared on his left shoulder. Fresh blood seeped out from that sword mark. Chen Chongqing's sword had actually once again pierced him. The intensity of the fire didn't decrease, instead, it increased exponentially. Liang Hongzhuang was enraged to the extreme. A red dancing robe descended from the sky, enveloping Chen Chongqing within. At this moment, another brilliant sword flash appeared. The sword chimes continued to resound throughout the mountains and plains, but it was not hurried, one after another, even a little slow, and the sword intent was not very strong. Yet, the dancing clothes that were like fire were unable to descend, unable to envelop Chen Chongsheng. Time was advancing between the sword glow and the dance of fire. After an unknown amount of time, a terrifying tearing sound suddenly resounded through the barren mountain. The flames that covered the mountains and plains suddenly disappeared without a trace. The sword glow also did not continue to light up. The two figures separated, facing each other in the mountains and plains, separated by a distance of several tens of feet, a light mountain breeze brushing past between them. Chen Chongsheng's face was very pale, the hand that held the sword couldn't stop trembling. Liang Hongzhuang's face was even paler, his entire body covered in blood, and his dancing clothes had already been completely shredded. Chen Chongsheng had struck out 7 times, but not once had he missed. At this point in the battle, victory and defeat had already been decided. The remnants of makeup and drops of blood were especially clear on Liang Hongzhuang's pale face. Fresh blood constantly dripped from his tattered dancing clothes. He stared at Chen Chongsheng, his eyes wide open, as if he could not understand just what had happened. Chen Chongsheng was somewhat at a loss. Even at this moment, he still did not really understand just what had happened. Su Li looked at Chen Chongsheng, his emotions somewhat complex. A youth at ethereal opening against a famous person at star condensation, it ended with the former's victory. In the history of the cultivation world, a rarely seen surpassing cultivation levels to kill had just happened before his eyes. In the past, he had accomplished surpassing cultivation levels several times. He believed that Qiushan, who had learned the sword from him for a month, could also do it when he was at the upper level of ethereal opening. However, the fact that Chen Chongsheng could accomplish such a thing, as well as the method he used, still made him very shocked. This battle was so ordinary and mediocre. Su Li understood that it was only because it was ordinary and mediocre that it was even more soul-stirring. Chen Chongsheng had not relied on his innate talent or bloodline, not on the heavenly way of the sword, not on the gift of the heavens and the starry sky, but on his own hard work and comprehension. This was not a genius, but it was far more powerful than a genius. In the long river of time, in the vast continent, had such a person ever appeared before? Su Li looked at Chen Chongsheng, silently thinking about this question. His fingers lightly tapped the yellow paper umbrella. Until the end, he had only tapped it 6 times. Yesterday I ran around for an entire day. Not to mention being tired, the old problem with my waist came up again. All sorts of laziness and squeamishness. I really want to rest for another day. In the end, when I looked at the calendar, I discovered that today is 213. To me who has written Jiangyi for almost 3 years, this really is an extremely important day. No matter what, I have to write some of it. As a result, there's this chapter. 7 swords, 6 umbrellas, exactly 13. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day. I will definitely update. I won't give little kids the chance to make mistakes and spend more money. Chapter 379. Liang Hongzhuang looked at Su Li, his face expressionless, as if he was a dead man. He asked, "Why?" Silence. No one could answer this question. He smiled bitterly and said, "I thought that the laws of heaven would always come in cycles. It's not that I won't avenge you, it's just that it's not time yet. It's just that it's a little late, but there will always be a result. Who would have thought that there's no such thing as the heavenly Tao? Why can a person like you live so well? Now that you're about to die, another person like him pops up." Chen Chongsheng lowered his head and didn't look at him. The hand that held the short sword slightly trembled. "How exactly did our Liang clan offend you? What benefits did the Tianliang Qin clan give you? More than 10 years ago, you wanted to exterminate my Liang family." Liang Hongzhuang's laughter grew louder and louder. His blood flowed faster and faster, and his voice grew more mournful. By the time he finished speaking, the question had already turned into a roar. It was the roar of an injured beast, and it was filled with rage, unwillingness, despair, and pain. It directly pierced into the deepest part of the soul of the person who heard it. Chen Chongqing lowered his head even more, his face even paler. His hand trembled more and more, as if he would not be able to hold onto the hilt of his sword in the next moment. He did not want to look at Liang Hongzhuang, who was already in a state of madness, and he also did not dare to look at Su Li. This was because he was very worried that if he were to look at it, he would feel irrepressible regret for what he had done, and thus fall into pain and struggle. Hearing Liang Hongzhuang's sorrowful and indignant questioning and seeing Chen Chongqing with his head lowered, Su Li still remained expressionless. What had already happened could not be changed, so whether or not he regretted it was meaningless. There was no need to reflect on it. Even if there was, it could only happen in his heart. He absolutely disdained explaining anything to the world. This was the kind of person he was. If it was in the past, no matter how miserable Liang Hongzhuang was, he would leave without batting an eyelid. Today, his expression did not change, but for some reason, he said a few words before leaving. Or was it because Chen Chongqing's head was hanging too low and his hand holding the sword was shaking too much? How many people and clans did your Liang clan's ancestors kill in the south when they were emperors? Su Li looked at Liang Hongzhuang and said expressionlessly, "As for exterminating your entire Liang clan, if I really wanted to do that, how could you still be alive today? How could Liang Wangsun still be alive?" His mood suddenly became a little irritated. He looked at Chen Chongqing and said coldly, "Why are you standing here and not leaving? Imitating loneliness or pretending to be desperate. Don't think that you have the right to lecture me just because you saved my life." After saying this, he walked towards the barren mountain. After a few days of recuperation, he was still heavily injured, but he could walk slowly. The two furry deer ate their fill of grass and returned to the field. Seeing Su Li walking off into the distance and Chen Chongqing still standing with his head lowered, they seemed somewhat perplexed, not knowing who to follow. Chen Chongqing raised his head and looked at Liang Hongzhuang. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he only said 2 words, "Sorry." He finally said these 2 heavy words, but his mood didn't become a bit more relaxed because of this. He reached out to grab the reins of the 2 furry deer's necks, silently chasing after that somewhat lonely figure. On the other side of the barren mountain was the south. Liang Hongzhuang could no longer support himself and fell to the ground. Looking at the 2 gradually leaving, he yelled in pain, "Do you really think you can return to the south? If you continue to follow him, you will also die." Chen Chongqing didn't turn his head back. He lowered his head and continued walking silently. Su Li walked very slowly. It didn't take long for Liang Hongzhuang to catch up. The furry deer bent its front knees and prostrated itself on the ground. He helped Su Li up. From start to finish there was no conversation. After passing through this barren mountain, they crossed over 2 other barren mountains. The furry deer stopped by a grassy slope that was as green as a carpet. Chen Chongqing dismounted from the back of the deer and rushed to the side of the road. He bent down and began to vomit. Su Li looked at him and said mockingly, "That guy didn't die, so what's there to vomit about?" Chen Chongqing waved his hand. He wanted to explain, but he couldn't suppress the discomfort in his chest and began to vomit again. This battle with Liang Hongzhuang was the first time he had directly and single-handedly defeated a star condensation expert. If this battle were not so ordinary and unremarkable, so understated, perhaps it would have been even more worthy of its place in history. However, the price he had paid was not ordinary. A battle of surpassing cultivation levels was naturally not as understated as it seemed on the surface. Under the pressure of Liang Hongzhuang's star domain, he had also suffered very heavy injuries. All the bones in his body felt like they were about to split apart. Previously, his body had been trembling the entire time. That was because of his emotions, but also because his body really could not hold on any longer. However, the true injuries were not in his body, but in his mind. He did not have Su Yorong's talent in calculations, nor did he have a sufficiently powerful bloodline. He had only just started on the path of learning the intellectual sword, and now he had to forcefully use the intellectual sword to meet the enemy. Moreover, he had to use 7 swords in one move. This was not something he could currently endure. The large amount of information that could even be described as a sea, or even as vast and boundless as the starry sky, directly squeezed out all his mind, causing his sea of consciousness to tremble until it was on the verge of collapse. His spiritual sense had been completely consumed by those 7 swords, and his sea of consciousness had become empty. The body of a cultivator was a boat in the sea of consciousness. Right now, his sea of consciousness had dried up. That boat was constantly falling in the empty space, forever without end. This was a very terrifying process. He felt that everything around him, the barren hills and grassy slopes, were constantly spinning and changing. The azure sky seemed to be currently falling over his head. This made him feel incomparably vexed, uncomfortable, dizzy, painful, and weak. It was like he had continuously drunk wine for 7 days and 7 nights. That wine was strong wine, and even bad wine. This sort of feeling was extremely painful, extremely uncomfortable. Moreover, this was a matter of the mind, and there was simply no way to expel it from the body. He vomited out all the roasted meat and wild fruits he had eaten last night and this morning, and he also vomited out his stomach juice. In the end, all that was left was something that looked like clear water. Even when he could not vomit anything out, he still did not stop. He began to retch, as if he wanted to vomit until the seas dried up and the rocks crumbled, until the end of time. Only by doing this could he express his attitude towards this world. Suli looked at the youth vomiting on the side of the road and said nothing. After some time, he used the yellow paper umbrella as a staff and slowly walked behind Chen Chongqing. He slowly raised the yellow paper umbrella and struck the back of Chen Chongqing's neck. With a thud, Chen Chongqing slowly fell to the ground. Before he collapsed, he used the last of his strength to ensure that when he fell backwards, he would not be stained by the filth that he had vomited out. However, he did not faint. His eyes were still open, looking at the sky. He was in incomparable pain and extremely weak. Suli indifferently said, "If you're not willing to faint, there's a chance that you'll go crazy." In that strike just now, he had used up all the strength that he had secretly accumulated over the past few days. He originally thought that it might not be enough to kill the enemy, but it could be used to save someone. However, he did not think that this youth's body would be so tough. Chen Chongqing opened his mouth like a fish on the verge of death. He weakly said, "Senior, there's a blade of grass on the mountain. You're not thinking of writing a poem before you die, are you?" Suli said, "Don't be like this, it makes people uncomfortable." Chen Chongqing raised his hand with difficulty and pointed at the blade of grass. "That's the 100 days intoxication." Just as Suli had said, if he continued like this, his sea of consciousness really might rupture, and he might directly die or become an idiot. Moreover, the most crucial thing was that right now, he really was in a very uncomfortable, very painful state. If he could guarantee that his vision would not be blurry right now, that he could clearly see the white clouds in the blue sky, he would definitely remove the needles at the first moment and knock himself out. However, he could not do it. Fortunately, when he fell, he saw a blade of grass that could knock him out. Suli understood what he meant. He plucked the blade of grass, and somewhat roughly tore it into pieces with his hands, stuffing them into his mouth. Chen Chongqing finally closed his eyes. His face was still pale, and his eyelashes trembled slightly. Suli breathed a few times tiredly, then sat down cross-legged. He glanced at the silent and uninhabited barren mountain, and his right hand rested on the handle of the umbrella. After a while, Chen Chongqing suddenly opened his eyes, and looked somewhat absent-mindedly at the sky. Su Li's eyelids drooped slightly. Still not willing to faint? Chen Chongqing said tiredly, the medicinal effect isn't that fast. Su Li said, then shut your mouth, close your eyes and wait. Chen Chongqing said with difficulty, but I have something I want to say to Senior. Su Li was silent for a while, then expressionlessly said, release. Senior, in the future, it's better if you kill less people. After saying this, Chen Chongqing felt that he had finally done what he had to do. His mind relaxed, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. Little friends, a holiday is a good thing, but you must take proper precautions. Don't let anyone die. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow, I want to strive to write over 4,000 characters. Chapter 380. Looking at the unconscious Chen Chongqing, Su Li slightly raised his eyebrows, as if deep in thought. This was because of the last sentence he had said, and also because of the many things Chen Chongqing had said and done in the past few days. In his long journey of traveling the 4 seas for several hundred years, he had seen many outstanding youths. Some of those youths were geniuses, and some were extremely determined. The youths he admired the most were all currently in the Mount Li sword sect. However, he had never seen a youth like Chen Chongqing. He had always thought that youths would always have a youthful spirit. The so-called morning sun and morning dew, new butterflies and fledglings, the aura of youthful life was so clear and impassioned. Chen Chongqing also had this sort of temperament, but it was even more indifferent. This youth was also a gust of spring wind, but the wind of early spring was very light, so fresh and refreshing that it made people feel relaxed and happy. Su Li gazed at the sleeping Chen Chongqing in silence, carefully observing him. Normally, when a youth was awake, they would often intentionally lower their voice and pretend to be calm and unhurried, so as to obtain the praise of their elders and the admiration of their peers. And when they were asleep, they would return to the appearance of their true age, revealing their innocent and pure side. However, Chen Chongqing was not like this. His eyes and brows were the eyes and brows of a youth, as clear and childish as the tea garden before the rain. However, his expression was still as calm as when he was awake, and even somewhat sorrowful. Why was it that even in his sleep, this youth's brows were still furrowed so tightly? What was he thinking? What was he worried about? What was he worried about? If his body always bore a pressure that he could not escape from even in the land of dreams, then why was it that when he was awake, he was so calm and unhurried that no one could feel it at all? Su Li was very clear that there was definitely something in Chen Chongqing's heart, but he did not want to ask, nor did he want to investigate. It was not that he was not curious, but because there were more important things to do. He raised his head to look at the boundless wilderness. His face was expressionless, his eyes like stars, and the chill gradually increased. The hand that gripped the yellow paper umbrella was slightly looser than before, but it was a more suitable posture for drawing a sword. The assassin called Lu Qing was currently in the middle of this barren wilderness, and he should be watching this place. The third rank on the continent's ranking of assassins was undoubtedly very frightening to a normal person, but under normal circumstances, it was not enough to make Su Li raise his head to look at him. It was just that the current situation was not normal. Chen Chongqing was unconscious and he was heavily injured. No matter how one looked at it, this was the best opportunity for the assassin to strike, unless the assassin decided to continue reciting the doctrine of conservatism. Su Li was suddenly rather nervous, so the expression on his face became even more indifferent. It had been many years since he had been this nervous, because it had been many years since anyone could threaten his life. He had thought that he had long since seen through life and death, but after Shui He and Liang Hongzhuang appeared, he realized that even with his sword-heart illumination, he still could not continue to maintain clarity of mind in the face of death. Perhaps it was because he had just experienced the most difficult test of life and death. In his life, he had encountered many tests of life and death and defeated countless enemies that seemed undefeatable. Compared to those opponents, People on the level of Shui, he and Liang Hongzhuang were not even worth mentioning. However, he was keenly aware that the moment he had been closest to death in his life was not in the snowy plains outside Shuilao City, nor was it by the cold stream in the longevity sect. Rather, it was not too long ago in that nameless mountain, when Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes were like fire as he threw himself at him. The reason why that was the moment he had been closest to death was because Liang Hongzhuang would definitely kill him, because Lu Qing was definitely hiding nearby. The most important reason was that he had no way of grasping his fate in his own hands. Whether it was outside Shuilao City against the shadow of the Demon Lord and the tens of thousands of demon soldiers, or in the cold stream against the 10-odd elders of the longevity sect with unfathomable cultivation, he had a sword in his hand, and he could swing it. As long as he had a sword in his hand, the world was Su Li's. Even if the god of death stood before him, he would not fear it. But, in that moment, he could do nothing. He could only entrust his fate to this youth called Chen Chongqing. Fortunately, this youth had proven that he was very trustworthy. This time, I really do owe you a life. Su Li shook his head as he looked at the faintly creased brow of the sleeping youth. The assassin was still hidden in the wilderness. For some reason, he still did not make a move. Perhaps it was because Chen Chongqing's performance or identity made him feel some fear, or perhaps it was because Su Li's hand had never left the handle of the yellow paper umbrella. At dusk, Chen Chongqing finally woke up. His face was as pale as snow, and his eyes were not as clear and bright as they usually were. It was like he had a hangover. Fortunately, his sea of consciousness had finally calmed down, so there should not be any danger. He looked at Su Li, but before he could say anything, Su Li expressionlessly said, "What do you want to say?" After a moment of silence, Chen Chongqing said, "As a junior, I do not know the story behind the events of the past, so it's hard for me to judge right and wrong. Perhaps Senior really did not kill wrongly, but as a son, taking revenge for his father is not wrong. If there is nothing wrong but you still want to kill and kill, then there must be something wrong with this matter." Su Li said, "As expected, you're still preaching." Chen Chongqing said, "On the snowy plains, Senior always said that you're not a good person, because you've killed too many people. From this, it can be seen that Senior also knows that killing too many people is not a good thing, so why not change?" Su Li's eyebrows twitched, and he said with a smile that was not a smile, "But when did I say that I wanted to be a good person? Since you don't want to be a good person, then why change and kill less people?" Chen Chongqing was speechless, and said somewhat helplessly, "Senior, why is there a need to strive to be first in everything, to argue everywhere? 100 barges vying for the current, wanting to argue but forgetting to speak. If you don't argue, then what kind of life is that?" Su Li said it very calmly and calmly. Chen Chongqing was silent for a very long time. Ever since he woke up, he had always been reading. After knowing that his body was not good, he thought about how to live a little longer. He felt that life was really the best thing in life, that living was the most beautiful thing. He very rarely thought about how to live. He thought about it, and then no longer continued to think about this question. He understood that in terms of his view of life, he was a youth from the countryside who could not even eat his fill, while a person like Su Li had eaten fish and meat every day for many years. Now, he began to pursue a light and healthy diet, searching for the meaning of inheritance and spirit in food. They had never been people of the same world. This did not mean that he had any conflict or antipathy towards the people of that world. On the contrary, he was very envious of the people of that world. Because the people of that world were the majority of the people of this world. Living was originally supposed to be like that. At the very least, it was more meaningful than the way some people lived. That Mountly disciple called Liang Xiaoxiao the things that Chen Chongqing encountered in the garden of Zhou, the things that he was willing to talk about, had already been told to Su Li for the most part, and he had also told him about Liang Xiaoxiao. It was just that a few details by the lake had only been completely filled in today. In his view, since the gate to the garden of Zhou had reopened, as long as Qi Jian and Zhixiu were still alive, Liang Xiaoxiao would definitely have already been punished. It was just that after experiencing the battle with Liang Hongzhuang, he was somewhat sensitive to the surname Liang, so he had mentioned it for Su Li's consideration. However, he had not imagined that Su Li's reaction would be so great. Hearing that Liang Xiaoxiao's sword had pierced Qi Jian's abdomen, Su Li's complexion darkened. It was as if a torrential rain was gradually gathering between his brows, and he could send out several bolts of lightning at any time. Finally, Su Li said, "He will die." Chen Chongqing thought to himself, "That's your Mount Li's business, and he really did deserve to die." However, he had not imagined that that damnable Liang Xiaoxiao had already died, and had even used his death to leave behind so many troubles. Su Li had already guessed why Liang Xiaoxiao would collude with the demons, but this matter involved Mount Li's clean reputation. Crucially, it involved the two bloody cases that he had single-handedly caused in the longevity sect and the North, so he was not willing to say too much to Chen Chongqing. "Just how did you see through it?" He turned to Chen Chongqing and asked. This question was naturally asking what method Chen Chongqing had used to see through Liang Hongzhuang's star domain. If the first sword was a guess, then what about the other 7 swords? Every sword did not miss, so it was naturally impossible for it to be a guess. Could it be that he had already learned the intellectual sword? Chen Chongqing very carefully thought it over. After confirming the situation at the time, he said, "It really was a guess." Su Li obviously did not believe it, but from his expression, it definitely did not seem fake. Most importantly, Chen Chongqing had no reason to deceive him, and most importantly, Chen Chongqing really did not have any reason to learn the intellectual sword so quickly. To be able to guess which star in the sky would move was already an extremely inconceivable matter, and to be able to guess the hole in the star domain of a star condensation cultivator was even more unimaginable, let alone him guessing 7 times in a row. If you really relied on luck, then your luck is already so good that it's not just luck. Su Li looked at him and said, "You are a person with great luck." Chen Chongqing did not understand. He asked, "Luck? What is the most important thing in cultivation? Willpower? Comprehension?" Su Li shook his head. "No, it's luck. Any expert that can dominate a region in the end, the so-called saints, are all people with extremely good luck. Because of this, they can escape danger so many times. Of course, luck is only for a moment, while luck is for a lifetime. So they are all people with great luck, including me." Chen Chongqing thought it over, then asked, "What determines luck?" "Of course it's fate." Su Li looked into his eyes and said, "So in other words, your fate is very good." Hearing this, Chen Chongqing actually had nothing to say in response. From the moment he was born, he had been considered to have a bad fate. Who would have thought that now, he would actually be said to have a very good fate? This made him feel somewhat absurd, somewhat comforted, and also somewhat sad. Continuing south, the 2 people and the 2 deer finally neared Tianliang County, and their learning of the sword also reached a new stage. After experiencing that battle with Liang Hongzhuang, Chen Chongqing was very clear on where his current weaknesses were. First of all, he needed an even more powerful spiritual sense and willpower. He understood why Su Li had said in advance that only after experiencing it would one have the qualifications to know that using the intellectual sword required sufficient strength, because the intellectual sword required even more extraordinary energy, or else the person using the sword would not be able to endure that tremendous amount of calculations, and would probably faint before the sword could even strike. Secondly, if he wanted to defeat a star condensation cultivator, he needed to increase his own output. Only like this could he seize that fleeting opportunity and directly deal a heavy blow to his opponent, thus avoiding the situation where 8 consecutive strikes were not able to kill Liang Hongzhuang. It must be known that that situation was truly very dangerous. If Liang Hongzhuang had been just a little stronger, able to endure a little longer, Chen Chongsheng would have collapsed from the shock to his sea of consciousness, and he and Su Li would have undoubtedly died. As a result, at dusk, by a stream, Su Li began to teach him a second sword style. Your output of true essence is too terrible, just like a child holding an embroidery needle. No matter how fast you are, even after stabbing 3,600 holes in your opponent's body, you still won't be able to stab your opponent to death. So a few days ago, I thought of a sword style. Su Li looked at Chen Chongsheng in the stream and said, "Do you want to learn it?" Chen Chongsheng did not answer, because this sort of thing did not need to be answered. As long as it was a sword user, who would not want to learn the sword from Su Li? Not to mention that this sword style was very clearly designed by Su Li for him. Moreover, he was currently very shocked. Looking at the middle-aged man by the stream, he opened his mouth, unable to say anything for a long time. According to these words, did it not mean that on that day when he discovered that there was a problem with his output of true essence, Su Li had begun to ponder this problem, and then in just a few days, he had designed a completely new sword style? What was a true genius? What was a grandmaster of the path of the sword? That was it. Su Li acted like he did not see him and continued to speak. He seemed to calmly introduce this newly created sword style. As for whether or not he was somewhat proud in his heart, one could tell a little from his slightly raised eyebrows. This sword style was called the blazing sword, and it still only had one move. To be more precise, it was a method of using the sword. If the intellectual sword was said to help the swordsman see through the weakness of a star condensation expert, then the blazing sword was said to help the swordsman explode with his sword energy and true essence, allowing him to obtain an enormous boost in a short period of time. Through this, he could deal even greater damage to a star condensation opponent. The two sword styles that Su Li had taught him were both very specific, as if they were specially designed to help him pass through the body. Chapter 381. What Chen Chongsheng said was not accurate. At the final moment of the grand examination, he had only prepared to use the final move of the Mountly sword style, but had not truly used it. However, the key to the final move of the Mountly sword style was the intent. Go Hanshi had seen through his intent and left the stage, so it was not wrong to say that he had used that move. Su Li was very clear on what the final move of the Mountly sword style meant, so he felt that he could not understand this youth more and more. However, since Chen Chongsheng understood this move and had used it, the final difficulty of learning the blazing sword no longer existed. The blazing sword was a sword move, and also a method of circulating true essence. It was a method that Su Li had created for Chen Chongsheng through his observations of him in the past few days. The amount or efficiency of a cultivator's output of true essence depended on the speed at which star radiance was burned and the width of the meridian channels. There was a certain upper limit. The higher the talent, the better the aptitude, the faster the speed at which star radiance was burned and the speed at which true essence could be transmitted. For people with innate bloodlines like Su Yorong and Qiushan Jun, there was no need to consider the limitations of meridian channels. As long as there was enough star radiance in their bodies, they could even endlessly output true essence. The amount of star radiance in Chen Chongsheng's body was not small, and there was no problem with meditative introspection. The greatest problem was that the true essence channels were too narrow, and there were even many meridians that were broken, so the efficiency of true essence output was naturally extremely low. As a grandmaster of the path of the sword, Su Li's most extraordinary aspect was that his understanding of the world far surpassed the scope of ordinary people. His methods of solving problems were very unexpected, but in reality, they were the most reasonable. He did not put his finger on the amount of true essence Chen Chongsheng had, nor did he attempt to solve the problem of his meridians. Instead, He used a fearless method to directly place his hopes of solving the problem on the method of burning star radiance. Of course, the one who needed to take the risk was Chen Chongqing, and the one who needed to be fearless was still Chen Chongqing. There are many methods or forms of burning. Normally, it pays attention to being neutral and gentle, melting the star radiance into clear water, dripping with your thoughts. Only like this can the thin water flow for a long time. However, this move requires you to use an even more violent method to burn your true essence. Su Li looked at him and said, "It's like countless wood shavings, sealed in a space. Suddenly, a source of fire appears, and those wood shavings will almost simultaneously ignite, releasing an extremely great heat and might, just like an explosion." Chen Chongqing listened to his words and imagined the scene in his sea of consciousness. He nodded. Su Li said, "The method of explosive combustion can help your true essence instantly rise to a certain level, breaking through those messy meridians of yours. From there, the lethality of this strike can be barely seen." "I understand," Chen Chongqing said, "but what does this have to do with the last move of the law sword?" Su Li looked into his eyes and said, "Countless amounts of true essence are burning in your body at the same time, like an explosion. It's possible to illuminate the planes through the sword energy and dazzle your opponent's eyes, but it's even more likely to directly burn you into an idiot, or explode you into pieces. If you don't have the determination to die, it's impossible to complete that final step." Chen Chongqing could feel that the black dragon's spiritual soul within the dagger was faintly reacting, remembering the scene of him performing meditative introspection in the underground cavern of New North Bridge. He couldn't help but feel a little emotional, thinking to himself that everything that had happened before had a meaning. Thinking of Su Li's reaction when he said that he knew the last move of the Mountly sword style, he resisted the urge to tell Su Li that he had many similar experiences. Although he was young, his attitude towards life and death was already very experienced. Su Li carefully explained the moves and sword intent of the blazing sword, then said no more, letting Chen Chongqing comprehend it on his own. Afterwards, he gazed at the mountains in the twilight, at the green grass on the other side of the stream, and said nothing. That assassin was very likely in that patch of grass. Chen Chongqing was not in a hurry to comprehend the sword. He smeared coarse salt on the fish he had cut up, then hung it over the fire and began to roast it. Since he had confirmed that the enemy had always been there, the bonfire was no longer a problem worth paying attention to. Accompanied by a slight burning smell, he followed Su Li's gaze to the green grass on the other side of the stream. After a while, he shook his head, thinking to himself that the assassin was truly extremely patient. He had actually followed them for so many days without making a move. Perhaps Zhixiu could do it, but he definitely could not. To him and Su Li, that assassin that had always been hiding in the mountains was an extremely great pressure. The two of them were very clear that at some point, that assassin would definitely appear, it was just that they did not know when. Just like Senior said, if you keep waiting like this, even if you wait until you die, you won't get any chance. Chen Chongqing said in his heart to that famous assassin that he had never met, because Senior is teaching me how to use the sword. I will become stronger and stronger, and when that time comes, you won't be able to kill us. After a very simple but delicious dinner of fat and tender white fish and sorghum rice, Su Li leaned against the furry deer and closed his eyes to rest. Chen Chongqing finished tidying up, then walked to the stream and sat down, formally beginning to comprehend the sword. He gazed at the green grass on the other side of the stream and thought about the 10,000 li of snowy plains in his body. That snow was the star radiance that he had gathered day and night. It was the initial form of true essence, and it was the source of all battle energy. Right now, he only needed to use his spiritual sense to completely ignite the snowy plains, and even the lake water that enveloped the spiritual mountain above the snowy plains, transforming it into an endless stream of energy and spirit. But this sword demanded that he not do this, because that method of combustion was still too gentle, not fierce enough. The speed at which star radiance was transformed into true essence was too slow. The blazing sword was based on the word burn. It had to be violent, decisive, and burn the body with fire. Chen Chongqing sat by the stream in silence. He watched the twilight gradually recede, watched the numerous stars cover his eyes, all the way until the morning light once more arrived. He used an entire night's time to finally learn how to use his spiritual sense to descend on the snowy plains, but not to ignite the snowflakes. Instead, he used that incorporeal energy to make the snowy plains even more fluffy, until the snowflakes left the ground and once more danced in the sky. The morning sun came out. The red glow covered the mountains and fields, and the stream water was completely red. Looking at the green grass on the other side of the stream that seemed to be burning, Chen Chongqing's hand slowly left the hilt of his sword. On the third day of learning the blazing sword, Chen Chongqing and Su Li encountered the third assassin on their way back south in a tea house on the side of the official road. This assassin was called Li Pingyuan, a tyrant of the north. He had countless deaths worn under his command, and it was said that this person had some unclear connections with the Bear Man tribes that had secretly defected to the demon race. Perhaps it was precisely because of this that he was able to more accurately determine Su Li's route to the south than anyone else and waited here for their arrival. Because this matter was too important and at the same time too urgent, the tyrant of the north, Li Pingyuan, had only brought a dozen or so of his most loyal subordinates. However, in this small tea house, it was already rather crowded. There were no customers in the tea house, and the faint smell of blood wafted through the air. The stove used to boil tea was already cold, and it seemed like it had not been lit for many days. The owner had probably died long ago, but it was unknown where his corpse had been buried. Chen Chongqing sat by the tea table, gazing at the tea in his bowl that had a strange smell. He said nothing, and it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. "Congratulations!" Su Li looked at him and said, "Killing this person, I trust that you won't have too much of a psychological burden. The next chapter will be very, very late, so late that it's hard to imagine, but it will definitely happen." Chapter 382. As a tyrant of the north, Lin Pingyuan was naturally extremely heroic. Even in the depths of spring, he still wore a fur cloak. Even though he had come to kill a person like Su Li, he still had to bring 10-odd subordinates, as if he was not at all worried that the news would leak out. What's a tycoon? Is this what a big tyrant is like? But a tyrant can only run amok in the village. A tyrant who can run amok in the entire northern lands should be called an ambitious and ruthless person. I thought I was an ambitious and ruthless person. He looked at Su Li and said, "Ambitious and ruthless people do not care about face. I will not be as stupid as Liang Hongzhuang. I have brought my most trusted subordinates and the determination to kill. I will definitely not care about any principles of fairness. If I can besiege you, then I will besiege you. If I can put 30 poisons in your tea, then I will definitely not miss a single one. I will dig as deep as I can." Normally, Su Li would be disinclined to pay attention to this sort of person, but today, for some reason, he seemed rather interested. He asked, "I feel that you brought too few people." Lin Pingyuan smiled and said, "If Senior hadn't been heavily injured by the demon experts, even if I brought all 3,000 soldiers, I still wouldn't have been a match for a single strike of Senior's. However, Senior is like a tiger that has fallen to the plains, so I only need to bring 10-some people. Moreover, today's matter needs to be kept secret, so bringing too many people isn't appropriate. If by any chance the immortals of the Mountly Sword sect find out that I killed Senior, do I still want to live?" Su Li smiled and said, "Since you're afraid, you still dare to come and kill me?" Lin Pingyuan said, "The price offered by the other party is too high. I have no choice but to gamble." Su Li sighed emotionally. "You really are worthy of being a great hero of the North. No, you're ambitious and ruthless person of the North. It's just that according to how ambitious and ruthless people act, when you kill us in a little while, these subordinates should also be silenced by you." Lin Pingyuan waved his hand heroically and said, "Senior, you don't need to sow discord. We have committed all kinds of evil deeds in our lives. We don't trust anyone but each other, so we trust each other very much." Su Li laughed, then turned around and said to Chen Chongqing, "Look, he even said that he doesn't shrink from any evil." Chen Chongqing had been looking at the blood on the floor, both fresh and old. Upon hearing Su Li's words, he gave a sound of agreement. Lin Pingyuan looked at him with a hint of doubt in his eyes. "Where did you come from, young man? Could he be a disciple of the Mountly Sword sect? In that case, I can only invite you to die with me." Chen Chongqing ignored him and continued to stare at the bloodstains on the teahouse floor. This place was not considered prosperous, but it was on the side of the official road after all. Presumably, there would be many tourists and merchants passing by every day. Judging from the bloodstains, many people had died here in the past few days. The owner of the teahouse was definitely dead, but how many innocent tourists and merchants had died? A gust of wind blew on the hillside outside the teahouse, and a buzzing sound came from behind the window. He looked up and saw a swarm of mosquitoes and flies flying around. It was a disgusting sight. Although it was late spring, the northern region was not considered hot. Where did so many mosquitoes and flies come from? The mosquitoes and flies descended once again, leaving Chen Chongqing's line of sight and descending into the gutter below the window. There were many corpses lying on the ground, and the scene was too horrible to look at. Su Li's congratulations were very reasonable. Lin Pingyuan and the people in the teahouse could all die. Shui had come to kill Su Li for the sake of the country, Liang Hongzhuang had come to kill Su Li for the hatred of his family, and this person and these people had come to kill Su Li for the sake of profit. They had committed all sorts of crimes, so there was no reason for them to live. Lin Pingyuan stood up and said, "The pit didn't trap your furry deer, and the poison in the tea didn't seem to work, but you still walked into this teahouse. I want to know if you can withstand so many of us." There were many people in the teahouse, and they were all very strong. They had all succeeded in purification, 4 of them were at the meditation realm, and 1 was actually at ethereal opening. As for himself, he was an expert at the star condensation realm. Chen Chongqing could not use the intellectual sword, because even if he really did see through the weakness of Lin Pingyuan's star domain and successfully defeated him, he might fall unconscious like last time. What about the remaining people? Fortunately, he had just learned a new sword style, so he could try it out. The teahouse suddenly exploded with shouts of killing. Lin Pingyuan did not care about the face of a so-called tyrant or ambitious character. He commanded his subordinates to attack Chen Chongqing and Su Li while he himself stood at the back of the crowd, ready to attack at any time. Chen Chongqing stood up and raised his head. His gaze passed through those sinister people and landed on Lin Pingyuan's body. With a clang, the dragon's cry dagger was unsheathed. Sword chi crisscrossed, and within the teahouse a fierce gale blew. The tables and chairs were all cut into pieces. A blazing chi enveloped the entire teahouse, and a bright ray of light shot out from the dagger. The surrounding crowd saw a burning dagger, and it seemed as if countless legendary golden crows flew out from the dagger. In just an instant, the temperature of the teahouse suddenly rose, becoming incomparably hot. The bloodstains on the floor of the teahouse, regardless of whether they were old or new, were all purified. The light and heat that gushed out from the dagger represented the boundless true essence. Within the crowd, cries of shock and pain continuously rang out, but those cries of shock and pain were very short. Behind the crowd, Lin Pingyuan's expression suddenly changed, becoming extremely serious. Chen Chongqing used the Yesher step, and his body suddenly blurred. He passed through the falling and disintegrating bodies, arriving in front of Lin Pingyuan, and thrust it out with his dagger. The burning true essence, the sword technique of the Golden Crow, the sword energy of the burning heaven sword, and the decisiveness of the final move of the Mountly sword style were all within this one strike. The blazing sword. A burning sword. The tea-house became even brighter, as if the golden crows that flew out from the dagger had merged into one, becoming a sun. The sun was so dazzling that even Suli could not clearly see the scene within. After an unknown amount of time, the wind in the tea-house stopped, and the light gradually receded. Chen Chongqing gripped the dagger in his hand, and slowly drew it back, as if he was drawing back a torch that could burn the heavens. With a light swish, an extremely deep bloody hole appeared between Lin Pingyuan's eyebrows. The tea-house was filled with dead people. Lin Pingyuan was also about to die. He stared at Chen Chongqing, his eyes filled with disbelief. He asked, "Just what right do you have to kill me?" He was a star condensation expert, a tyrant of the North, an ambitious and ruthless person who did not shrink from any crime. Just what right did he have to be killed by an ethereal opening youth? "Because you deserve to die," Chen Chongqing said. Lin Pingyuan did not understand, nor did he need to understand, because he was dead. He fell to the ground, and under the slashes of the remaining sword intent, he became 10 odd pieces of flesh. There was no one left standing in the tea-house other than Chen Chongqing. The tables and chairs in the tea-house had already been shattered, and everything else had been shattered. Only the stool under Suli and the teapot in his hand were still intact. The tea in the teapot was extremely poisonous, and it was unknown why he had carried the teapot. Chen Chongqing walked in front of him. Suli lifted the teapot, and slowly poured the herbal tea in the teapot onto his body. With a sizzling sound, the herbal tea touched Chen Chongqing's face and body, and then suddenly evaporated into water vapor. Because his true essence had been ignited, Chen Chongqing's body was boiling hot. At this moment, the temperature had dropped slightly, but his face was still completely red, and his eyes still contained the remnants of a berserk ember, making him seem rather terrifying. "This sword is too violent. I still can't hold on." After saying this, Chen Chongqing collapsed without any warning, just like that time when he defeated Liang Hongzhuang and crossed over 2 barren mountains. Fainted again? Suli looked at him on the ground and said angrily, "What do we do when that person comes? Quickly wake up." Chen Chongqing was already unconscious, so he naturally had no way to answer his question. There were corpses everywhere in the tea-house, and there were pieces of flesh everywhere. It was a tragic sight, and the smell of blood was pungent. Suli calmed down and slowly closed his eyes. At some point, his right hand had grasped the handle of the yellow paper umbrella. Time slowly passed. The mosquitoes and flies outside the window flew into the window. No matter good or evil, virtuous or foolish, death was all the same to gods and these mosquitoes. Suli opened his eyes and said expressionlessly, "Get up, it seems like he won't appear." In the tea-house, other than the corpses, there was only the unconscious Chen Chongqing. Who was he talking to? Chen Chongqing opened his eyes and stood up with some difficulty. He supported him out of the tea-house, called over the furry deer in the distance, and continued his journey south. After a while, a person suddenly crawled out of the pile of corpses in the tea-house. That person walked onto the official road, and looked at the figure of the man and the deer in the south. He said nothing and then disappeared again. "I really am diligent and talented. See you tomorrow." Chapter 383. Continuing south, they encountered another 3 groups of assassins. Chen Chongqing continued to kill, and then he continued to faint. This process repeated itself, not many times, but each time it was extremely dangerous. In this process, the assassin Lu Qing, who had always been hiding in the mountains, never appeared. There were even times when he suspected that the assassin had been thrown off. Although they had already encountered 6 groups of assassins, compared to the various powers searching for them around Tianliang County, this was already the best result. Suli had an extremely clear grasp of the situation, and he also knew very well where those people that wanted to kill him would appear. He also knew even more clearly how to deal with the situation. Where did this ability come from? The choice of the route was completely arranged by Suli. They never went to places with many people, but they also did not blindly walk through the wilderness. More often than not, they disguised themselves as ordinary travelers and traveled south with ordinary people on the official roads. Chen Chongqing felt more and more admiration for his arrangements, but also more and more doubts. One day, he finally could not suppress the doubts in his heart and asked why it was like this. Suli said, "The world is not good for hiding people. The best place to hide people is in the human world, so walking in the human world is the safest, but also the most dangerous. The choice depends on the heart." Chen Chongqing then asked what did the so-called "depends on the heart" mean, and how could he judge it? Suli thought it over and said, "Wait until you are like me and have killed so many people and been killed by so many people, then you will naturally have the ability in this aspect." Chen Chongqing said after thinking it over. If he needed to learn it like this, then it was better not to learn it. Chen Chongqing had not learned the story and ability of the assassin in the night, nor could he learn it. His talent in this aspect was clearly somewhat lacking, but his talent in the path of the sword began to reveal its edge under Su Li's guidance. His grasp of the intellectual sword grew deeper and deeper, but his spiritual world still could not support it. His use of the blazing sword grew more and more smooth, but of course, he still had to pay an extremely heavy price from the ignition of his true essence. However, 2 more star condensation experts had been defeated by his sword. Counting it like this, he had already successively completed 5 surpassing cultivation levels, and these 5 surpassing cultivation levels had been continuous. Among his opponents were a long-established divine general like Shui He, as well as a great hero of the north like Lin Pingyuan. Right now, he was still a youth not even 16 years old. He didn't know if something like this had ever happened in the history of the cultivation world, nor would he know in the future, but at the very least, in the several hundred years since Su Li had left the mountain, something like this had never happened, and he himself had never done it. Of course, this did not mean that Chen Chongqing was stronger than Su Li back then, because there were many specific differences. For example, Su Li's mind was more focused on the Garden of Zhou, and at that time, he did not have the opportunity to endlessly engage in battles of life and death with star condensation experts. However, Chen Chongqing's performance was already sufficiently strong, so strong that Su Li was somewhat moved, and then moved. On a certain night, Su Li began to teach Chen Chongqing the third sword style. Chen Chongqing had only used the time it took for the cold meat soup pot to heat up last night to memorize the sword technique. Su Li looked at him and sighed, "You really are very suited to learning the sword." Chen Chongqing was a little embarrassed and said, "Senior is flattering me. Suitable for learning the sword was an extremely high praise, let alone coming from Su Li's mouth." Su Li looked at him and said, "If I did not have Qiushan and to inherit my legacy, perhaps I really would have chosen you." Chen Chongqing waved his hand and said, "There's no need, there's no need. Junior is the successor of the orthodox orthodoxy, so it's impossible for me to take another master." Su Li understood that with Chen Chongqing's personality, it was only natural for him to refuse. It was just that he had refused so quickly, without even the slightest hesitation to make things difficult for him, which still made Su Li feel very uncomfortable. As a result, he expressionlessly analyzed the 6 battles that Chen Chongqing had encountered. Using detailed and accurate data and calculations, he finally came to a conclusion: your luck is good, or else you would have died a long time ago. What right do you have to be proud of yourself? Chen Chongqing thought about it and had to admit that the reason he and Su Li were able to live until now was not because of Su Li's insight, Su Li's teaching of the sword, or his talent in the path of the sword, but because of luck on the road. Su Li had already exclaimed many times in praise of his luck, or in other words, good fortune. He said with great certainty that since he and Chen Chongqing were both people with great fortune, if they traveled together, even if they wanted to die, it would not be easy. After being said so much, he became somewhat numb. Occasionally, Chen Chongqing would even begin to accept that his fate was very good, but when he thought that his fate really was very bad, he would often feel very perplexed. After finishing the leftover cold meat soup from last night, Chen Chongqing tightened his clothes and rubbed his cheeks that were pale from weakness. He began to quietly comprehend the third sword that Su Li had taught him, unwilling to waste a single moment. Su Li leaned on the back of the furry deer and looked at the youth's back in silence for a very long time. Then he looked south and thought silently. "Qiushan, there's a pretty good guy coming from behind you. You have to run a little faster, or else he really will catch up." The escape through the wilderness and the official road finally came to an end, and the two arrived outside Xuanyang City. Chen Chongqing gave the 2 furry deer to a farmer outside the city. He took out some silver and a dagger, threatening and enticing the farmer to not leak the news and to take good care of the 2 furry deer. Su Li looked at this scene with a sneer on his face, but he said nothing. Xuanyang City was the largest city in the northern part of Tianliang County. The city was bustling and bustling. Su Li and Chen Chongqing disguised themselves as ordinary traveling merchants and silently snuck into the city. They found an inn to stay in, and no one actually noticed them. This was the first time Chen Chongqing had slept on a bed after entering the garden of Zhou. His head touched the pillow and he began to snore, just like how Su Li had slept soundly in the hot springs of the snowy mountains. This time, he slept for an entire day and night. It could be imagined just how great the mental pressure on his journey had been, and just how exhausted he was. After waking up, Chen Chongqing walked to the window and looked at the bustling streets of Xuanyang City in silence for a very long time. He felt that he could not continue like this, because he was truly very tired, very weak. He did not want to continue on the road and then wait for those assassins and experts to appear wave after wave. He did not like waiting for the unknown, did not like this sort of feeling. He found Su Li and said, "Many people have already come to Tianliang County. I believe that the people of the Mount Li Sword sect have already received the news. Since that's the case, why do we still need to hide our tracks?" Su Li replied, "I said before, I only trust myself." Chen Chongqing said nothing. On this journey, he had seen very clearly that Su Li appeared to be a very undisciplined, and sometimes even very cute, senior and expert, but in reality, he was just like his name, very distant from this world. Su Li did not believe in humanity, did not believe in the human heart, did not believe in his own world, did not speak with this world, so he would never ask this world for help. He walked alone, and he had already walked for several hundred years. But Chen Chongqing did not want to walk like this. He always believed that if he maintained goodwill towards the world would also display goodwill towards him. When you saw the charming green mountains, the green mountains would also find you much more pleasing to the eye. If this continues, we'll be at too much of a disadvantage. While we're sleeping, all we encounter are enemies. We simply can't find a single helper. Where can we find a helper? The world is formed from night and day. In the past few days, we've always been walking in the darkness, so all we see is night, all we encounter is darkness. However, if we walk into the sunlight, perhaps we can see the sunlight. Chen Chongqing looked at Su Li and said very seriously, "Why is Senior not willing to try?" Su Li said, "Where did this sour and rotten poet come from? I'm not willing to use my life to prove that your view is wrong." Chen Chongqing replied, "But I very much want to prove that Senior is wrong." Su Li arched his brows and looked at him. "You can't act recklessly." Chen Chongqing asked, "What do you mean by acting recklessly?" Su Li was very angry. "I know what you want to do, brat. Don't forget, this is my life. My life is up to me, not the heavens, and it's even less up to you. But, for Senior to be able to live until now, isn't it precisely because of my efforts? Chen Chongqing looked at him very seriously, his sparkling eyes wide open. He looked very cute, but in Su Li's eyes, he was very repulsive. Su Li felt that his hands were somewhat cold. Suppressing his voice, he yelled, "You little madman, Before he finished speaking, Chen Chongqing walked straight to the window and used both hands to push it open. In the depths of spring, Xuanyang City was a cauldron of voices, and the spring sunshine was bright and beautiful. The window was pushed open, and the sunlight and spring wind poured into the room, illuminating the gloomy night. A shout as clear and bright as the spring sunshine resounded through the streets of Xuanyang City. Mount Li's junior martial uncle, Su Li, is here. There's still an update on the 29th day of the 12th month. This is really TSK. In a little while, there will be a summary of the last questions and answers before the Lunar New Year in WeChat. Yes, also, this year's annual vacation will begin tomorrow. Just like the previous years, there will be a break of 10 days. On the 10th of the new year, the update will resume. Here, I wish everyone a happy new year, a bright spring sunshine and youth every year.